Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to talk about a case that shook a small California community to its core. This is a story about trust, betrayal, and the unthinkable darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary faces. As we settle in, let me tell you about Sandra Cantu. The town of Tracy, California sits about 60 miles east of San Francisco in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley. In 2009, it was home to roughly 78,000 people. A place where neighbors knew each other, where children played freely in mobile home parks, and where Sunday school teachers were pillars of the community. Sandra Renee Cantu was born on March 8, 2001. She was 8 years old with dark brown eyes and light brown hair that caught the sun when she played outside. She lived at the Orchard Estates mobile home park with her mother Maria, her grandparents, and 3 older siblings. The mobile home park was Sandra's entire world, a small neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where children rode their bikes freely and where doors were rarely locked. Sandra was a second-grade student at Melville S. Jacobson Elementary School. Teachers described her as cheerful, energetic, full of life. She had that innocence that only 8-year-olds possess. The kind that sees the world as inherently good, that trusts easily, that believes in the kindness of others. At the Orchard Estates mobile home park, Sandra had friends everywhere. She would skip from trailer to trailer, knocking on doors, asking if friends could come out to play. The mobile home park was safe, or so everyone thought. Parents let their children roam freely. There was a sense of community here, of protection, of shared responsibility for one another's children. Among Sandra's closest friends was a 5-year-old girl who lived just a few doors down from her family's trailer. The little girl's mother was Melissa Huckabee, a 28-year-old woman who seemed to embody everything wholesome about small-town America. Melissa taught Sunday school at the nearby Clover Road Baptist Church, where her grandfather Lane Lawless served as pastor. She was a single mother, raising her daughter on her own. To the outside world, she appeared devoted, religious, trustworthy. Sandra often played at Melissa's trailer. The 2 little girls, Sandra and Melissa's daughter, would spend hours together, their laughter echoing through the mobile home park. Maria Chavez, Sandra's mother, never worried when her daughter went to play at Melissa's home. After all, Melissa was a Sunday school teacher. She was a mother herself. What could be safer? Friday, March 27, 2009 started like any other day for Sandra Cantu. She went to school, laughed with her friends, learned her lessons. After school, she played at a friend's house until approximately 4:00 p.m. when she returned home. Sandra walked through the door of her family's trailer, and her mother was there, as always. Maria Chavez was preparing dinner, and Sandra would normally help her. It was their routine, their time together at the end of each day. But on this particular Friday, Sandra wanted to go back outside to play. She kissed her mother, a simple gesture that would haunt Maria for years to come, and asked if she could visit a friend. Maria said yes. Why wouldn't she? The sun was still bright in the California sky. The mobile home park was safe. Sandra was only going a few doors down. Sandra changed out of her school clothes and put on her favorite outfit, a pink Hello Kitty t-shirt and black leggings. She slipped on her Hannah Montana flip-flops, the ones that made a soft slapping sound when she walked. Then she headed out the door, her dark hair bouncing as she moved. What nobody knew at the time was that the Orchard Estates mobile home park had a surveillance system. A neighbor had installed security cameras that captured parts of the common areas. At 3:54 p.m. on March 27, 2009, those cameras recorded Sandra walking through the mobile home park, but she wasn't just walking, she was skipping. Her movements were carefree, joyful, the embodiment of childhood innocence. In the footage, which would later be broadcast across the nation, you can see Sandra skip past trailers, her pink Hello Kitty shirt bright against the muted colors of the mobile home park. And then something catches her attention. She turns her head, looking toward one of the trailers. The cameras capture this moment, the instant when Sandra's attention is drawn to something or someone off screen. After that moment, Sandra Cantu was never seen alive again. When Sandra didn't return home for dinner, her mother began to panic. Maria called out for her daughter, walking through the mobile home park, knocking on doors. Sandra always came home for dinner. She always helped her mother prepare the meal. This wasn't like her. As the evening wore on and darkness fell, Maria's panic turned to terror. She contacted the police at 7:53 p.m., reporting her daughter missing. Within hours, the Tracy Police Department mobilized a search effort. Officers fanned out through the mobile home park, knocking on doors, questioning residents, searching yards and sheds. The FBI was called in almost immediately. Over the course of the weekend of March 28-29, police dogs, equestrian teams, all-terrain vehicles, and a helicopter from the California Highway Patrol were brought in to search for Sandra. Volunteers from the community joined the effort, combing through fields, checking irrigation canals, searching anywhere an 8-year-old girl might hide or might have been taken. A $22,000 reward was offered for information in the case. Pictures of Sandra were posted throughout Tracy. Her smiling face stared out from utility poles, store windows, and community bulletin boards. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, hoping for good news, praying for Sandra's safe return. But in the back of everyone's mind was a darker possibility. Children don't just vanish. Not in Tracy. Not in a safe mobile home park where everyone knows everyone. Melissa Huckabee was among those who appeared to help with the search. She attended vigils for Sandra. She tearfully ran up to investigators at a vigil for the missing girl. She spoke to reporters, expressing her shock and sadness. She mentioned repeatedly how Sandra and her daughter were friends, how Sandra had been at her home earlier that very day. But Melissa's story had inconsistencies. She told the Tracy Press that Sandra had visited her home on the day of her disappearance to play with her 5-year-old daughter, but that she turned Sandra away because her daughter needed to pick up her toys. She said Sandra had then gone to another friend's home. Melissa also told reporters that she had left her suitcase in the driveway that day and that it was missing. It was an odd detail to mention. Why would someone bring up a stolen suitcase when a child was missing? On the very day Sandra disappeared, Melissa sent a text to Sandra's mother that said, "Tell the police that I had something stolen today." Around 4 p.m. The timing was specific, deliberate, and deeply suspicious. 10 days passed. 10 days of searching, of hope fading, of a community growing more desperate and more heartbroken with each passing hour. Volunteers continued to look for Sandra, but as the days stretched on, the question changed from "where is she?" to "what happened to her?" On April 6, a suitcase containing Sandra's body was found during routine draining of an irrigation pond. The pond was located on Becchetti and Whitehall roads, about 2 miles north of the Orchard Estates mobile home park. Farm workers had been draining the irrigation pond, a routine maintenance task, when they saw something dark and rectangular submerged in the murky water. It was a black Eddie Bauer suitcase, the kind with wheels that you'd take on a vacation or a business trip. But this suitcase held no clothes, no toiletries, no travel documents. Inside was Sandra Cantu, still wearing her pink Hello Kitty t-shirt and her Hannah Montana flip-flops. The autopsy revealed a laceration on Sandra's lower lip and an abrasion on her left elbow, as well as injuries to her genital area consistent with the diameter of a rolling pin handle. A blood-stained piece of cloth was found tied in a noose around Sandra's head, consistent with homicidal asphyxiation. The medical examiner, Dr. Bennett Omalu, reported that Sandra died between 4 and 6 p.m., the day she first went missing by homicidal asphyxiation. Toxicology reports confirmed the presence of alprazolam, a benzodiazepine used to treat anxiety, in Sandra's system. Sandra had been drugged before she died. Someone had sedated her, assaulted her, strangled her, and then stuffed her small body into a suitcase and thrown it into a pond like she was nothing more than garbage. The news devastated Tracy. The entire community had held out hope, however faint, that Sandra might still be alive. Now that hope was shattered, but hope was replaced by something else. Determination. Determination to find whoever had done this to an innocent 8-year-old girl. The profile that FBI experts assigned to the case was a white male aged between 25 and 40 with a criminal history of sexual assault or child pornography. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created this profile based on the evidence: the sexual assault, the disposal of the body, the calculated nature of the crime. In the vast majority of cases involving child abduction and murder, the perpetrator is male. But as investigators dug deeper, something didn't add up. Upon finding Sandra's body, police became suspicious of a number of coincidences regarding Melissa Huckabee. First, there was the suitcase itself. Melissa had previously told the Tracy Press that she had left her suitcase in the driveway that day, and that it was missing. Investigators confirmed that the suitcase that held Sandra's body belonged to Melissa. It was her Eddie Bauer suitcase, the one she had reported stolen on the very day Sandra disappeared. Then there was the note on March 28, 2009, the day after Sandra vanished. Melissa showed authorities a handwritten note she claimed she found in her trailer park that read, "Canty locked in stolen suitcase thrown in water. On Becchetti Rod and Whitehall Rod. Witness." The spelling errors were obvious: stolen instead of stolen, on instead of on. But the information was specific, too specific. Investigators analyzed the note. The handwriting matched samples of Melissa's writing. Even though she had attempted to disguise it, she hadn't found this note. She had written it herself. But why? Was she trying to insert herself into the investigation? Was she trying to control the narrative? Or was she, on some level, wanting to be caught? Police also discovered a post-it note in Melissa's car, with the address of the irrigation pond where Sandra's body was later found. She had written down the location before the body was discovered. She knew exactly where Sandra was because she had put her there. Investigators obtained a warrant to search the Clover Road Baptist Church, where Melissa taught Sunday school and where her grandfather served as pastor. When the church was searched on April 6, 2009, police found a rolling pin with blood on it that contained Sandra's DNA. The rolling pin had a bent handle, consistent with it being used as a weapon. There was also evidence that a cord from the window blinds had been cut, the same type of cord that had been used to tie the suitcase shut. The evidence pointed in one direction: Melissa Huckabee, the trusted Sunday school teacher, the mother of Sandra's friend, had murdered Sandra Cantu. On April 10, 2009, Melissa Huckabee was arrested before midnight Friday, about 5 hours after she drove herself to the local police station at the request of officers. She walked through the door of the police department and started a conversation with officers, said Police Sergeant Tony Sheneman at a news conference. She was calm, cool, and collected. Then she became very emotional. She went back and forth from being calm to emotional. During the interrogation, Melissa's demeanor fluctuated wildly. One moment she was composed, almost detached. The next moment she was sobbing, playing the role of the distraught neighbor. But as the hours wore on and the evidence mounted, she became resigned, according to Sergeant Shinneman. The arrest sent shockwaves through Tracy. Finding out, one, that it's a woman that was responsible for Sandra's kidnapping and murder, and then finding out it's a member of the community is another blow. Finding out it was someone that Sandra's family knew is a double blow, said Tracy Police Sergeant Tony Sheneman. Sergeant Sheneman told the press, "There was some speculation early on that it would be a man. It's unusual for it to be a woman statistically, and according to the FBI, everyone who had cooperated with police had been looking for the monster, the man that did this. Discovering the perpetrator was a woman and a Sunday school teacher that defied everyone's expectations. Sandra's family was devastated." Sandra's aunt Angie Chavez told reporters, "Just utter shock and disbelief. I can't imagine a mother doing this to a child." Melissa was charged with kidnapping, rape with a foreign object, and murder with special circumstances. If convicted, she could face the death penalty. As prosecutors built their case, a disturbing timeline emerged. The last evidence Sandra was alive, captured in surveillance video at 3:54 p.m. March 27, 2009, came just 8 minutes before Melissa was seen driving her Kia sports utility vehicle out of Orchard Estates Mobile Home Park and toward Clover Road Baptist Church. 8 minutes. That's all the time it took for Sandra to go from skipping carefree through her neighborhood to being in Melissa's vehicle, heading toward the place where she would die. Prosecutors stated that Sandra's body, which was stuffed inside the black Eddie Bauer suitcase, was pulled from the same irrigation pond where a former U.S. Marine and his wife reported seeing Melissa during that 30-minute window. By the time Maria Chavez called police to report Sandra missing at 7:53 p.m., it was already too late. According to prosecutors, Sandra had already been killed and her body disposed of by Melissa. We have information that Sandra, by the time she was reported missing to us, that she probably had already been murdered, said Tracy Police Chief Janet Thiessen. The evidence suggested that Sandra was likely killed at Clover Road Baptist Church. Melissa had taken Sandra there to her grandfather's church, a place that should have been a sanctuary. Instead, it became the scene of unthinkable horror. What happened in that church? The autopsy and physical evidence told a brutal story. Sandra had been drugged with alprazolam, the same anxiety medication found in Melissa's home and purse. She had been beaten with the rolling pin. She had been sexually assaulted, and then she had been strangled with a piece of cloth twisted into a makeshift noose. Dr. Bennett Omalu, the medical examiner in the case, said the way Sandra's body had been arranged in the suitcase was proof of a calm, calculating mind at work. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of rage. This was methodical, planned, executed with chilling precision. After killing Sandra, Melissa drove to the irrigation pond and threw the suitcase into the water. Then she returned to the mobile home park and began the elaborate performance of being the concerned neighbor, the helpful Sunday school teacher who wanted to assist in finding poor missing Sandra. Melissa's behavior in the days following Sandra's murder was as disturbing as the crime itself. She didn't simply try to avoid suspicion. She actively inserted herself into the investigation in bizarre and incriminating ways. She wrote the note about Sandra being in a suitcase in the pond and pretended to find it. According to the transcripts, Melissa tearfully ran up to investigators at a vigil for the missing girl and said she found a note saying Sandra's body was in a suitcase and gave the address of where it could be found. But prosecutor Thomas Testa told jurors that the action showed the consciousness of guilt. Melissa wasn't trying to help, she was trying to control the investigation, to appear helpful while simultaneously misdirecting authorities. 2 days after Sandra disappeared, Melissa invited Sandra's big sister over for a sleepover with her daughter. Can you imagine? She invited the sister of the girl she had just murdered to spend the night in her home. Miranda Chavez did spend the night and told the grand jury Melissa only mentioned Sandra's disappearance once, asking Miranda if they had found any evidence. It was as if Melissa was playing a game, testing how close she could get to Sandra's family without being caught. Or perhaps she enjoyed the twisted intimacy of being near the grieving family, knowing what she had done. One of the first things Melissa brought up after Sandra went missing was the question of whether the girl was sexually molested. Why would that be her first concern? Unless, of course, she already knew the answer. Prosecutors say Melissa checked herself into a hospital 8 days after the murder for swallowing a razor blade. Was this a genuine suicide attempt, or another performance designed to garner sympathy and appear as a victim herself? Throughout the investigation, Melissa tried to point fingers at others. She mentioned neighbors who seemed suspicious. She created narratives that implicated other people. Investigators say Melissa lied, feigned emotions, and tried to cover her tracks as she talked to investigators and texted her grandmother, whom she lived with. As the case moved forward, prosecutors had to make a decision. Should they seek the death penalty? The evidence was overwhelming. The crime was heinous. But there was another consideration: Sandra's family. A death penalty case could take years, even decades, to resolve. It would mean endless appeals, constant media attention, and no closure for Maria Chavez and her family. They would have to relive Sandra's death again and again, in courtroom after courtroom. Ultimately, Melissa pleaded guilty to the kidnapping and murder of Sandra and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole in 2010. The rape charges were dropped as part of the plea agreement. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Melissa admitted to taking Sandra's life. The sentencing hearing on June 14, 2010 was emotional. Maria Chavez faced the woman who had killed her daughter. The courtroom was packed with community members, reporters, and Sandra's family. Melissa stood before the judge and read a prepared statement. She said, "I still cannot understand why I did what I did. This is a question I will struggle with for the rest of my life." She apologized to Sandra's mother. She claimed she didn't understand her own actions, that her words rang hollow to many in the courtroom. She said Sandra died without suffering, and that she was not raped, despite what the autopsy showed. Prosecutor Thomas Testa said after the hearing, "It's hard for me to believe that Sandra Cantu did not suffer." The physical evidence told a different story than Melissa's carefully crafted statement. Sandra had suffered. She had been terrified. She had felt pain. The judge sentenced Melissa to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would never walk free again. She would never see her own daughter grow up. She would spend the rest of her life behind bars, paying for what she had done to Sandra Cantu. The question that haunted everyone, from investigators to prosecutors to the Tracy community, was simple. Why? Why would a Sunday school teacher murder her daughter's friend? What could possibly motivate such a senseless act of violence? The prosecutor in the case speculated that Melissa killed Sandra for attention. This theory aligned with some of Melissa's behavior, the way she inserted herself into the investigation, the dramatic finding of the note, the constant need to be at the center of the story. Melissa's ex-husband, Johnny Huckabee, told reporters that she suffered from depression and other mental health problems. She did suffer from depression. She did have issues with her self-persona, who she saw herself as. Tracy police said Melissa has been diagnosed with manic depression and schizophrenia. Mental illness can explain some behaviors, but it doesn't excuse murder. Millions of people live with mental health challenges and never harm anyone. Some experts speculated about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where someone harms others, particularly children, to gain attention or sympathy. There were reports that Melissa's own daughter had a history of unexplained illnesses, which raised questions about whether Melissa had been harming her own child before she killed Sandra. Prosecutor Thomas Testa offered another theory. "I would say that Melissa was tempted by these girls. Maybe Sandra started saying she was going to tell her mom, and Melissa got scared and tried to silence her," Testa said, noting that asphyxiation is a slow and painful way to die. This theory suggested that Melissa had been sexually interested in the children around her, including Sandra. Perhaps she had made advances or engaged in inappropriate behavior, and Sandra had threatened to tell someone. In a panic, Melissa decided to silence her permanently. But the truth is, we may never know the real reason. Melissa herself claimed not to understand why she did what she did, and given her history of lying and manipulation, we can't even trust that claim. Perhaps she knows exactly why she killed Sandra, and simply refuses to say, or perhaps there is no reason that would make sense to anyone who hasn't lived inside her disturbed mind. One of the most chilling aspects of this case was the evidence that Melissa had planned Sandra's murder, or at least had the presence of mind to execute it. With methodical precision, the drug alprazolam was found in Sandra's system. The same drug was also found in Melissa's home and purse, suggesting that Sandra had been sedated prior to her death. Melissa had drugged Sandra deliberately, likely to make her compliant and easier to control. The choice of location, her grandfather's church, showed calculation. It was a place Melissa had access to, a place where she wouldn't be questioned or suspected. It was also a place that held symbolic weight. How does someone commit such an act in a house of worship? The disposal of the body showed planning as well. Melissa knew about the irrigation pond. She had scouted the location. Investigators found the address written in her car. She knew the pond was remote enough that the suitcase might not be discovered for a long time, if ever. It was only the routine draining of the pond that brought Sandra's body to light. Though Melissa left the church crime scene a mess. Blood splatters, blood-stained rolling pin, cut-up cord from the blinds used to tie the suitcase. She apparently tried to make up stories, and went out of her way to point the finger at some of her neighbors in an attempt to sidetrack the cops. Melissa told investigators a story about playing hide-and-seek with Sandra, suggesting Sandra get in the suitcase to jump out and scare Melissa's daughter and Sandra's sister. She said Sandra agreed, and she zipped up the suitcase but then forgot the child was inside it. She said when she got to the church and remembered, she unzipped the case and the victim appeared to be lifeless. She claimed she tried to do CPR and that her head was spinning out of control and she was not thinking straight. But the prosecution's summary of the case did not support that story. The physical evidence, the drugs, the sexual assault, the strangulation told a completely different tale. Melissa hadn't forgotten Sandra was in a suitcase. She had deliberately drugged her, assaulted her, and killed her. The murder of Sandra Cantu changed Tracy forever. Andrea Stegmeyer, a Tracy mother of 4, and the PTA co-president at Sandra's Jacobson Elementary School, said the adults in Tracy were dealing with the murder and other crimes a lot worse than the kids are. The community had lost its innocence. Parents no longer let their children roam freely. The unspoken trust that had existed in places like the Orchard Estates mobile home park evaporated. If a Sunday school teacher could murder a child, then who could be trusted? Stegmeyer's youngest daughter, Grace, who was 7, was a recess and after-school playmate of Sandra's. The two would switch desks in their second-grade classrooms for different subjects. Telling Grace that her friend was found dead was the hardest thing I've ever done, Stegmeyer said. She didn't understand how somebody could do that. It's a question the adults in Tracy grappled with as well. Especially when the person alleged to be responsible was a Sunday school teacher who many in the community trusted with their children. And what about your neighbors? Stegmeyer wondered. Tracy had been dealing with multiple crimes against children in the months leading up to Sandra's murder. On the day that Melissa was arraigned on charges of raping and killing Sandra, a man who had been a substitute teacher in Tracy's schools for the last 5 years was in another courtroom in the same Superior Court to face charges he molested about a dozen children and possessed child pornography. Just months before Sandra's disappearance, an emaciated teenager with shackles still around his ankle escaped the clutches of a family he had been living with. The community was reeling from one tragedy after another, but Sandra's murder was different. It hit closer to home. It involved a trusted member of the community, someone who attended church, who taught children about God and morality, who seemed so normal on the surface. Sandra Cantu's memory continues to be deeply honored by the Tracy community, where she is affectionately referred to as Tracy's Angel. Her elementary school, Melville Jacobson Elementary School, celebrates her life through various dedications, including the Sandra Cantu Playground, Sandra's Cottage, and Sandra Cantu Buddy Benches. These memorials serve as a reminder of the little girl with the bright smile and the pink Hello Kitty shirt, a reminder to stay vigilant, to trust carefully, to protect the vulnerable. Sandra Cantu was 8 years old when her life was stolen from her on a sunny Friday afternoon in March. She should have grown up. She should have made it to high school, graduated, maybe gone to college. She should have fallen in love, traveled, experienced all the joys and sorrows that make up a human life. Instead, she became Tracy's Angel, a symbol of memory, a cautionary tale. Her mother, Maria Chavez, lives with the pain of that loss every single day. She lives with the knowledge that she kissed her daughter goodbye and sent her out to play, never imagining it would be the last time. She lives with the what-ifs. What if she had said no? What if Sandra had stayed home to help with dinner? What if she had never befriended Melissa Huckabee's daughter? But those questions have no answers. There's no rewriting what happened on March 27, 2009. There's only the brutal truth. A trusted member of the community betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. Melissa Huckabee sits in prison today, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. She will never leave those walls. She will grow old behind bars, living with what she did, or perhaps not living with it at all. Perhaps she has convinced herself of her own lies. Perhaps she truly doesn't understand why she murdered an innocent child. Or perhaps she knows exactly why and simply refuses to give anyone the satisfaction of an explanation. Sandra Cantu's story is a tragedy that reminds us to stay vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to remember that evil doesn't always look like we expect it to. Rest in peace, Sandra. Tracy's Angel, forever 8 years old. Forever missed. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the cold early morning hours of March 25th, 2015, a motorist driving along Valley Road on the southern outskirts of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, noticed something that would forever change the lives of everyone connected to an 18-year-old girl named Brittany Jane Gargole. The road was desolate, flanked by empty fields and the distant silhouette of the city landfill. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't expect to find anyone at 6 in the morning, let alone a young woman lying motionless in the dirt. But there she was. This is the story of Brittany Gargole. A story about friendship, betrayal, and how a single photograph posted on social media would become the key to solving a murder that seemed at first impossible to crack. Brittany Jane Gargole was born on August 31st, 1996 in Saskatoon to parents Suzanne Gargole and Everett Hilbaum. From the beginning, Brittany's life wasn't easy. Her mother struggled with addiction, and her father was largely absent from her life. These weren't the kind of circumstances that would typically lead to a bright, ambitious teenager. But Brittany was different. She was raised primarily by her grandmother, and despite the challenges of her upbringing, Brittany blossomed into someone her friends described as bubbly, hyper, and full of life. Her friend Nikki Allen remembered how they would knock on each other's windows late at night, sneaking out to share pizza and Slurpees, doing their hair and makeup together, talking about boys and dreams, and everything 18-year-olds talk about when the world still feels infinite. Brittany attended Nutana Collegiate, where she was working toward her grade 12 diploma. She was just weeks away from graduation in March of 2015. So close to that milestone that marks the end of childhood and the beginning of everything else. But Brittany wasn't just focused on school. She had started working full-time at the age of 17, juggling multiple jobs while maintaining her studies. She worked at the Saskatoon German Cultural Center, a job she loved, and she also did catering work for Vern's Pizza. Her friend Atasha Story remembered Brittany's drive, her ambition. She had goals. Atasha would later say, "She wanted to build and own hotel chains. I knew right away she would go places." Brittany loved the outdoors. She went snowboarding with her family, camping in the summer, boating on Saskatchewan's lakes. She was adventurous and independent, with a strong will and a tendency to speak her mind. She loved fashion and shopping, showing off new outfits to her large network of friends. She was beautiful and vibrant, with a smile that people remembered long after seeing it. But beneath that sunny exterior, there was also longing. Despite being raised by her grandmother, Brittany craved a relationship with her mother. She wanted that connection, that sense of belonging that had always felt just out of reach. Perhaps that's why she bonded so strongly with Cheyenne Rose Antoine, another girl who knew what it was like to grow up without the stability most people take for granted. Cheyenne Antoine and Brittany Gargole met in 9th grade. From the outside, they seemed like an unlikely pair, but they connected over their shared experiences of difficult childhoods. While Brittany had been raised by her grandmother due to her mother's struggles, Cheyenne's story was even darker. Cheyenne had lost both of her parents early in life. She was raised in the foster care system, bouncing from household to household throughout her childhood and adolescence. The system that was supposed to protect her failed in the worst way. Cheyenne was a victim of sexual abuse during those formative years. When she was 15, she lost her mother, and the grief and trauma sent her spiraling. She started using drugs, trying to numb pain that seemed too heavy to carry. Despite, or perhaps because of their troubled pasts, Brittany and Cheyenne became close. They were best friends, the kind who understood each other's wounds without having to explain them. They went out together, partied together, supported each other, in a world that had been unkind to both of them. They had found each other. By March 2015, both young women were 18 years old. Brittany was on the cusp of graduation, ready to launch into the future she'd been working so hard to build. Cheyenne was still struggling with her demons, still using drugs, still trying to find solid ground in a life that had never felt stable. On the night of March 23rd, 2015, they made plans to go out together. Just a normal night out in Saskatoon, a chance to drink, to dance, to forget about everything else for a few hours. Neither of them knew that this would be the last time they went out together. Neither of them could have predicted how the night would end. It started innocently enough. Brittany and Cheyenne got ready at Brittany's grandmother's house, taking time with their makeup and hair, picking out outfits, taking selfies, all the rituals of young women preparing for a night out. At 12:02 a.m. on March 25th, they posted a photo on Facebook. In the picture, both girls are smiling, faces close together, the warmth of friendship evident in their expressions. Brittany is on the right, Cheyenne on the left. Cheyenne is wearing a distinctive black braided belt around her waist. It was just another selfie, the kind that gets posted and forgotten, scrolled past by hundreds of people without a second thought. But this photograph would become crucial, the single piece of evidence that would eventually unravel what happened that night. Before heading out, the two friends stopped at Atasha Story's house. Brittany needed to borrow some money for gas. Atasha remembered that moment clearly. I told her to be careful, Atasha would later recall. I said, if you need me, call me, and I'll come pick you up or whatever. She gave me a hug, and that was it. That was my last interaction with her. From there, Brittany and Cheyenne went out into the Saskatoon nights. According to what Cheyenne would later tell police, they went bar hopping, starting at the Manchester Brew Pub, and eventually heading to the Colonial Pub and Grill. She said they were drinking heavily, doing drugs at a house party somewhere in between venues. Security footage would later confirm that both girls were indeed at the Manchester pub. They were seen on camera, laughing, drinking, appearing to have a good time. At the Colonial Pub, police would later check the surveillance tapes there and find nothing. Despite Cheyenne's claims, there was no evidence that either girl had ever set foot in that bar. What really happened during those dark hours between midnight and dawn is something that took nearly 2 years to fully understand. But at some point in some place, something went terribly wrong between these two friends. At approximately 6:00 a.m. on March 25, 2015, a motorist was driving along Valley Road on the southern outskirts of Saskatoon when he spotted something on the side of the road near the landfill. As he got closer, the shape became clearer, and his stomach dropped. It was a young woman, lying motionless in the dirt. He immediately called 911. Within minutes, emergency services arrived at the scene. The young woman was still alive, barely, but gravely injured. She was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The damage was too severe. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The police secured the scene and began their investigation. The woman had no identification on her, but they found several items near her body. A black leather jacket, a watch, and most significantly, a black braided belt lying in the dirt beside her. It didn't take long for police to identify the victim. Her face was recognizable, and a quick search of social media accounts led them to Brittany Jane Gargle, the 18-year-old who had just been weeks away from graduating high school. The medical examiner's report came back with devastating clarity. Brittany had been strangled to death. The marks on her neck suggested that the killer had used the belt found at the scene, the black braided belt that now sat in an evidence bag at the police station. There were also signs of a struggle. Marks on Brittany's car, which was found nearby, showed dusty streaks consistent with the pattern of a wide web belt being dragged across the surface. Importantly, the medical examiner found no evidence of sexual assault. This wasn't a random attack by a stranger. The level of violence, the personal nature of strangulation, the location of the body, everything pointed to someone who knew Brittany personally. The belt was sent to the forensics lab for DNA analysis. Technicians found 2 DNA profiles on it. One matched Brittany Gargle, and the other belonged to an unknown individual. As news of Brittany's death spread through Saskatoon, the community was devastated. Her friends couldn't believe it. Her family was shattered. Her father took time off work to grieve, struggling to comprehend how his daughter, so full of life and ambition just hours before, could be gone. Friends created a fundraising page called the Brittany Gargle Family Tragedy Fund to help with funeral costs. Messages poured in on social media from people who had known Brittany, who had been touched by her energy and kindness. One friend wrote, "I was blessed to call this girl my best friend. I'm going to miss seeing your smiling face and having your positive energy around." Meanwhile, police began the difficult work of piecing together Brittany's final hours. Detectives started where they always do in cases like this, with the victim's social circle, her last known whereabouts, anyone who might have seen her that night. They scoured Brittany's social media accounts, building a timeline of her movements. That's when they came across Cheyenne Antoine's Facebook post, made several hours after Brittany's body was discovered. "Where are you? Haven't heard from you? Hope you made it home safe." To the casual observer, it looked like a concerned friend checking in. But to investigators, it was a starting point. Cheyenne had clearly been with Brittany that night. The selfie they'd posted together proved that she might have been the last person to see Brittany alive. Police brought Cheyenne in for questioning. She appeared distraught, explaining that she and Brittany were best friends who had known each other since ninth grade. She described their night out in detail: the drinking, the bars they'd visited, the house party they'd attended. According to Cheyenne, she and Brittany had gone to the Manchester pub first, then moved on to the Colonial Pub and Grill. She said that at some point during the night, around 4:00 a.m., Brittany had started talking to an unknown man in his 30s. Cheyenne claimed that Brittany left with this man, and that was the last time she saw her friend. Cheyenne also said that after parting ways with Brittany, she had been dropped off at an assisted living facility where her uncle lived. She'd gone to visit him in the early morning hours. It was a plausible story. Young women meet strangers at bars all the time. Maybe Brittany had trusted the wrong person. Maybe this unknown man was the killer. But as detectives dug deeper, cracks began to appear in Cheyenne's account. First, they checked the surveillance footage from the Colonial Pub and Grill. They reviewed every minute of video from the night in question, looking for any sign of Brittany and Cheyenne. They found nothing. Despite Cheyenne's claims, neither girl had ever been to that bar. Senior Crown Prosecutor Robin Ritter would later say that police quickly realized the visit to the Colonial simply did not happen. Then they checked Cheyenne's story about visiting her uncle at the assisted living facility. Security footage from that location also proved problematic. There was no record of Cheyenne visiting her uncle that night. When confronted with these discrepancies, Cheyenne's uncle admitted something troubling. Cheyenne had asked him to lie for her. She'd wanted him to tell police that two black men had killed Brittany. It was a desperate attempt to misdirect the investigation, to create a false narrative that might take suspicion away from her. But why would Brittany's best friend want to mislead the police investigating her murder? As the investigation continued, detectives kept coming back to that selfie posted at 12:02 a.m. There was something about it that nagged at them. They studied it closely, examining every detail of the image. And then someone noticed the belt. In the photograph, Cheyenne Antoine was wearing a distinctive black braided belt around her waist. It was the same type of belt, the same style, the same appearance as the belt found next to Brittany's body. The belt that had been used to strangle her to death. Sergeant Ernie Loutied, one of the investigating officers, would later reflect on this moment. Here's your key piece of evidence, and it's in a picture on Facebook. It doesn't get much better than that when you're trying to prosecute somebody for murder. The belt was resubmitted for more comprehensive DNA testing. The unknown DNA profile that had been found on it alongside Brittany's was run through the database again. With more advanced techniques, this time they got a match. The DNA belonged to Cheyenne Rose Antoine. Suddenly everything shifted. The grieving best friend, the concerned young woman who had posted on social media looking for her missing friend, the person who had provided police with a detailed account of Brittany's last night. She was wearing the murder weapon in a photograph posted hours before the murder. In May 2015, police brought Cheyenne in for another interview. They confronted her with the DNA evidence, with the photograph, with all the inconsistencies in her story. But Cheyenne maintained her innocence. She had nothing new to tell them. She insisted she didn't know what had happened to Brittany. Without a confession, and with the investigation still ongoing, police didn't have quite enough to arrest her. Not yet. They needed more. It took nearly 2 more years of meticulous investigation, of following leads and building the case piece by piece. But in March 2017, police finally arrested Cheyenne Rose Antoine. She was charged with second-degree murder and causing indignity to a body, the legal term for leaving Brittany's body on that desolate road like discarded trash. Cheyenne was 20 years old by then. She'd spent the past 2 years living with the knowledge of what she'd done. Perhaps thinking she'd gotten away with it, perhaps tormented by guilt and fear. We may never know what those 2 years were like for her. But during that time, something else had happened. Someone had come forward. A witness who claimed that Cheyenne had confessed to them on the night of the murder. According to this witness, Cheyenne had shown up at their house in the early morning hours of March 25th, hysterical and barely coherent. After getting drunk and high, she told her friend the truth. She had hit Brittany. She had strangled her. This witness's testimony, combined with the DNA evidence in the photograph, was finally enough. Cheyenne was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. At first, Cheyenne maintained her innocence. But as the case proceeded toward trial, something shifted. Perhaps it was the weight of the evidence against her. Perhaps it was genuine remorse. Perhaps it was the advice of her lawyer that a confession might lead to a lesser charge. On Monday, January 15th, 2018, Cheyenne Rose Antoine stood in a Saskatoon courtroom and changed her plea. She pleaded guilty not to second-degree murder, but to the lesser charge of manslaughter. And for the first time, she told the truth about what happened that night. According to Cheyenne's confession, she and Brittany had indeed gone out drinking and partying on the night of March 23, 2015. They had gone to the Manchester pub, as the surveillance footage confirmed. They had attended a house party where they'd consumed alcohol and used drugs. Likely cocaine or methamphetamine, though Cheyenne's memory of the specifics was hazy. As the night wore on and they both became increasingly intoxicated, they'd stopped at a McDonald's around 4:30 a.m. Cheyenne's last clear memory was from around that time. After that, everything became fragmented, viewed through the distorted lens of severe intoxication. At some point after McDonald's, the two friends got into an argument. Cheyenne couldn't remember what the argument was about. Maybe it was something trivial, the kind of disagreement that wouldn't matter at all in the sober light of day. Maybe it was something deeper, some old wound or resentment that had been festering beneath their friendship. We'll never know. What we do know is that the argument escalated. In her intoxicated state, Cheyenne snapped. She hit Brittany. And then, in a moment of rage or panic or some combination of both, she removed the black braided belt from around her own waist and wrapped it around her best friend's neck. She strangled Brittany Gargle to death. Afterward, Cheyenne claimed to have blacked out. She said she couldn't remember the actual act of killing, couldn't remember dragging Brittany's body to the side of Valley Road near the landfill, couldn't remember leaving her there and driving away. But she remembered enough to know what she'd done. She remembered enough to go to a friend's house that night and confess, hysterical with the horror of it. She remembered enough to lie to police, to create false stories about unknown men and bar visits that never happened, to ask her uncle to provide a false alibi. The prosecution acknowledged that they couldn't prove criminal intent, the level of premeditation required for a murder conviction. Cheyenne's severe intoxication, her fragmented memory, the spontaneous nature of the crime, these factors led to the reduced charge of manslaughter. In court, Cheyenne appeared remorseful. She apologized to Brittany's family, though no words could possibly undo what she'd done. Her lawyer emphasized her difficult childhood, the trauma she'd experienced, her substance abuse problems, all the factors that had contributed to that fatal night. On January 15, 2018, Cheyenne Rose Antoine was sentenced to 7 years in prison for the manslaughter of Brittany Gargle. It was a joint submission, meaning both the prosecution and defense had agreed on the sentence. The charge of causing indignity to a body was stayed. 7 years. That's what Brittany's life was worth, in the eyes of the legal system. 7 years for strangling your best friend to death and leaving her body by the side of the road like garbage. For Brittany's family and friends, no sentence could ever feel sufficient. And her victim impact statement, Christy Wickenhauser, Brittany's stepmother, described the ongoing devastation. Brittany's younger sister, who was just 5 years old when Brittany was killed, felt guilty any day she didn't think about her murdered sister. That's the kind of wound that never heals. The kind that ripples out through families and communities, changing everyone it touches. Brittany never got to graduate high school. She never got to pursue her dream of studying business management. She never got to build those hotel chains she talked about with such confidence. She never got to see what she could become. All of that was taken from her by the person she trusted most. The irony is almost unbearable. Brittany and Cheyenne had bonded over their difficult childhoods, their shared experience of being abandoned by the people who should have protected them. They'd found friendship in their mutual understanding of pain, and yet in the end it was that very friendship that became the vehicle for Brittany's death. Cheyenne began serving her sentence in a Canadian prison. Under the Canadian justice system, she would be eligible for parole after serving 2/3 of her sentence. She was granted statutory release in May 2024, ordered to live in a residential drug treatment center. But the story doesn't end there. Just days after her release, staff at the treatment center found syringes and pills in Cheyenne's room. She tested positive for amphetamines. The center withdrew their support, and Cheyenne soon found herself in trouble again. In a tragic echo of her past behavior, Cheyenne was charged in connection with a high-speed chase in a stolen vehicle. The Parole Board of Canada revoked her statutory release, noting in their decision that she had successfully deceived your case management team, and ultimately the board, into believing you were motivated to attend further treatment to address your substance abuse and trauma. The decision continued. You then breached virtually all of your special conditions within 1 day of your release, choosing to immediately acquire and use illicit substances, and absconding from the treatment facility where you were ordered by the board to reside. Cheyenne was sent back to prison. The cycle of self-destruction that had defined so much of her life continued, unbroken. The murder of Brittany Gargall raises questions that have no easy answers. How does someone kill their best friend? What combination of trauma, substance abuse, and circumstance can turn affection into violence in a single night? Cheyenne Antoine was a victim herself of the foster care system, of sexual abuse, of parental loss, of addiction. None of this excuses what she did, but it helps us understand how a person becomes capable of such an act. Hurt people, as the saying goes, and Cheyenne had been hurt in ways that most of us can't imagine. But Brittany was hurt too. She grew up with an absent father and a mother lost to addiction. She was raised by her grandmother, always longing for the maternal connection she couldn't have. Yet Brittany channeled her pain into ambition, into work ethic, into dreams of a better future. She chose hope over despair, determination over destruction. Two young women, both dealt difficult hands by life. One became a murderer, one became a victim. The difference between those paths is sometimes terrifyingly thin. There's also something deeply unsettling about how social media played a role in this case. That selfie taken in a moment of friendship and fun, posted with the casual thoughtlessness of youth, became the key evidence in a murder investigation. The belt around Cheyenne's waist in that photograph would be around Brittany's neck just hours later. It makes you think about all the photographs we post, all the moments we document without realizing their significance. Brittany and Cheyenne were smiling in that picture, unaware that it was documenting the final hours of their friendship, the final hours of Brittany's life, and the evidence that would eventually bring her killer to justice. Sergeant Ernie Lodi said it perfectly. Here's your key piece of evidence, and it's in a picture on Facebook. It doesn't get much better than that when you're trying to prosecute somebody for murder. But there's something sad about it too. The way that final image of friendship has been transformed into a piece of evidence. A tool of prosecution, a symbol of betrayal. Those two girls in that photograph are frozen in a moment before everything fell apart, before intoxication and anger and violence destroyed everything between them. In the aftermath of Brittany's death, her friends and family struggled to hold on to the memory of who she really was. Not just a victim, not just a cautionary tale, but a real person with dreams and quirks and a future that was stolen from her. They remembered her work ethic, the way she balanced multiple jobs and school with a maturity beyond her years. They remembered her ambition, her plans to build hotel chains, her determination to make something of herself despite the obstacles she'd faced. They remembered her love of the outdoors, the snowboarding trips, the camping adventures, the lazy days on the boat. They remembered how she loved fashion, how she'd show off new outfits to her friends, how she cared about looking good and feeling confident. They remembered her personality, bubbly and hyper and full of life, independent and strong-willed, someone who spoke her mind, someone whose smile could light up a room. Nikki Allen, one of Brittany's close friends, captured something essential when she said, "I wish she didn't go the way she did. I wish I had a chance to say goodbye." That's what murder steals from us, not just the person, but all the moments that should have come after. The goodbye we should have gotten to say, the graduation ceremony that should have happened, the wedding and the career and the grandchildren and all the beautiful mundane moments of a life fully lived. Brittany was 18 years old when she died. She'd lived for 67,781 days. She had perhaps 22,000 more days ahead of her. 60 years of life she should have gotten to experience. All of those days, all of those possibilities were erased in a single night of drunken violence. Her obituary tried to capture her essence. Brittany was adventurous, independent, strong-willed, and always spoke her mind. She was beautiful, vibrant, warm-hearted, and will be deeply missed by her family and friends. But no obituary can really capture a whole person. No words can bring her back. No sentence given to her killer can restore what was taken. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you might think about the fragility of it all. How quickly things can go wrong. How a night that starts with selfies and laughter can end in tragedy. And you might think about friendship and how it requires trust, but also how that trust can be betrayed by substances and anger and moments of madness that we can't take back. You might think about the young women in your own life, daughters, sisters, nieces, friends, and feel grateful that they're safe. That they made it home from their nights out, that the arguments they've had with friends never escalated into violence. Or you might simply let the story wash over you. Another chapter in the long, dark history of human beings hurting each other, of lives ended too soon, of justice that never feels quite adequate. The murder of Brittany Gargle isn't unique. Every day somewhere in the world, someone's best friend, someone's daughter, someone's almost graduate is killed in a moment of rage or fear or intoxication. Every day families are shattered by losses that make no sense, that offer no comfort, that leave only questions without answers. But each of these stories is also singular. One life, one person, one irreplaceable human being, who will never get the chance to become who they were meant to be. Brittany Jane Gargle was born on August 31st, 1996. She died on March 25th, 2015, strangled by her best friend and left by the side of a desolate road. She was 18 years old, weeks away from graduation, full of dreams about hotels and business degrees and a future she would never see. She mattered. Her life mattered. And the fact that we're still telling her story, still remembering her name, still thinking about what happened to her on that cold March night, that matters too. Rest easy tonight, knowing that Brittany's story has been told. And perhaps as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for a girl who never got to graduate, never got to build her hotels, never got to grow old, a girl who deserved so much more than she got. A girl named Brittany. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, where eucalyptus trees line residential streets and neighbors know each other by name, a young woman's life was about to intersect with darkness in the most tragic way. This is the story of Celeste Mano, a vibrant 23-year-old whose kindness became her vulnerability, and whose desperate pleas for help echoed through a system that wasn't listening. Sometimes the most ordinary encounters lead to extraordinary consequences. Sometimes a simple handshake at the end of a workday becomes the beginning of something sinister. And sometimes, despite doing everything right, despite following every rule and seeking every protection available, the system fails. This is one of those stories. Celeste Mano was born on November 22, 1996, in Catania, Italy. When she was still young, her family made the journey to Melbourne, Australia, seeking new opportunities and a fresh start. They settled in Mernda, a suburb in Melbourne's northeast, where Celeste would grow up surrounded by love. Her mother, Aggie DiMauro, would later describe her daughter as someone with nothing not to love. Celeste had one of those smiles that you could see from across a room, the kind that made everyone around her feel like they mattered. Her laugh was infectious, bubbling up from somewhere deep and genuine, and when she got going, it was impossible not to join in. Growing up, Celeste was a cheerleader at Lawler Secondary College. She loved the energy, the teamwork, the way it felt to move in perfect synchronization with others. But she was also academically minded, driven by curiosity about what made people tick. After high school, she enrolled at RMIT University, where she studied criminology and psychology. The irony of this choice would not be lost on her family later. Celeste wanted to understand the darker corners of human behavior, to make sense of why people did terrible things. She never imagined she would become the subject of the very crimes she was studying. By her early 20s, Celeste was working at Serco, a call center in Melbourne. It wasn't glamorous work, but she approached it with the same warmth and competence she brought to everything else. Her colleagues adored her. She had recently started dating Chris Ridsdale, a co-worker who couldn't believe his luck. Time with her was always amazing, Chris would later recall. When she was smiling, you could see it from a mile away. The relationship between Celeste and her mother was extraordinarily close. Aggie was protective, sometimes overprotective, but Celeste understood it came from love. Aggie would often tell her daughter how blessed she felt to be her mother. Comments that would make Celeste respond with affectionate protest. "Stop, Mom. You're my mom." They had that kind of relationship where they could finish each other's sentences, where a single look conveyed volumes. Celeste also had a younger brother, Alessandro, born when she was 4.5. The role of big sister came naturally to her. She was the kind of person who made everyone feel special, who remembered the small details about people's lives and asked about them later. At 23, Celeste's future stretched out before her like an open road. She had dreams, plans, a loving family, and a new relationship that made her happy. She was studying what she was passionate about and working toward a career where she could make a difference. Everything was going well, until it wasn't. June 2019. It should have been an unremarkable day at the call center. Louis Sacco was being let go. He was 35 years old, 12 years older than Celeste, and had been working as a team leader at Serco. But his performance had been poor, and management had made the decision to terminate his employment. These things happen. People lose jobs every day. They move on, find new opportunities, learn from their mistakes. As his team leader, Celeste had the uncomfortable responsibility of escorting Lai from the building on his final day. It's one of those awkward workplace moments that no one enjoys. She handled it with grace, the way she handled most things. On his way out, she courteously shook his hand and wished him well. It was a small gesture, a simple act of human kindness during what must have been an embarrassing moment for him. "Good luck," she told him, meaning it sincerely. For most people, that would have been the end of it. A brief encounter, quickly forgotten amid the rush of daily life. But Louis Sacco wasn't most people. To him, that handshake, those few words of encouragement, that moment of human connection became something else entirely. In his mind, Celeste's kindness transformed into something it was never meant to be. He began to believe there was a deeper meaning behind her words, a hidden message in her smile. He convinced himself that she cared about him in a way that went beyond professional courtesy. He became obsessed. Born in Iraq in 1984, Louis had migrated to Australia with his family in 1992 when he was 8 years old. Those who knew him described him as a loner, withdrawn, socially awkward. He had no known history of romantic relationships. His dismissal from Serco seemed to trigger something in him, and Celeste became the focus of his fixation. It started with messages on Instagram. At first, they might have seemed merely awkward, the sort of thing you could dismiss as someone who didn't quite understand social boundaries. "I'm sorry, but I can't stop thinking about you," one early message read. "I have never felt like this about anybody in my entire life. It's bordering along OCD. I'm totally infatuated with you, captivated and fascinated by you. You're all I think about." Another message revealed the depth of his fixation. "After leaving you, my productivity and my personal life and my new job has been impacted. This obsession with you, which is a crush, is an addictive and destructive feeling that is interfering with my ability to concentrate, deal with others, and go about my daily routine." Celeste was uncomfortable but tried to handle it politely. She had been raised to be kind, to give people the benefit of the doubt. She sent him gentle but clear responses, explaining that she wasn't interested, that she wanted him to stop contacting her. She tried to let him down easy, the way women are often taught to do, worried that a harsh rejection might make things worse. Although it didn't stop, the messages kept coming, and slowly their tone began to shift. As the months wore on, Livy's messages became more frequent and more disturbing. What had started as declarations of infatuation evolved into something darker. The messages became vulgar, degrading, sexually explicit. He created multiple Instagram accounts so he could continue contacting her even after she blocked him. Over the course of the year, he would send more than 140 messages from various accounts. Celeste blocked him repeatedly. She changed her privacy settings. She stopped posting as much on social media. But nothing worked. He always found a way to reach her. By late 2019, Celeste was frightened. She confided in her mother and her boyfriend Chris about what was happening. The three of them decided it was time to go to the police. This is where Celeste did everything right. She reported the stalking. She documented everything. She saved all the messages, kept a record of every incident. She was prepared to do whatever the authorities told her to do. But when she walked into the police station seeking help, she encountered a response that was distressingly common for stalking victims. The officers she spoke with seemed uninterested, dismissive. They told her that Li Wei hadn't actually broken any laws yet. They advised her to get off social media, essentially suggesting that by having an online presence she was inviting the harassment. It was a form of victim blaming, and it left Celeste feeling helpless and frustrated. She had done nothing wrong. She had shared her life online the way millions of people do every day. The problem wasn't her social media usage. The problem was the man who couldn't accept that she didn't want to hear from him. Each time I went to my local station, all they would do was say, "He hasn't broken any laws, so we can't do anything." One stalking victim told a later inquiry. The sentiment echoed what Celeste experienced, but Celeste didn't give up. She kept going back to the police, kept reporting each new message, each new incident, and gradually the harassment escalated beyond the digital realm. Louis began following her. She would spot him driving past her workplace. He would park outside, just watching. He drove past her family home, learning the neighborhood, studying the layout of the streets. He used Google Earth to pinpoint the exact location of her house. He found the floor plan of her home online and used it to identify which room was hers. The realization that he knew where she lived sent chills through Celeste and her family. This wasn't just online harassment anymore. This was someone who was planning, preparing, getting closer. Throughout all of this, Celeste continued to plead with police to take her seriously. At one point, she threatened Louis that she would involve law enforcement, and for a brief period the messages stopped. Maybe he had moved on, Celeste hoped. Maybe it was finally over. But then came 2020, and with it the COVID-19 pandemic. Australia, like much of the world, went into lockdown. People were isolated, stuck at home, their routines disrupted. Research would later show that stalking incidents increased during this period, as perpetrators had more time and fewer distractions. For Louis, the isolation seemed to intensify his obsession. In July 2020, after a full year of harassment, Celeste was finally able to obtain an interim intervention order against him. This is a legal document, issued by a magistrate, designed to protect one person from another's aggressive or harassing behavior. It's meant to be a shield, a formal warning that says, stay away, leave this person alone, or face legal consequences. Louis contested the order, but it was granted anyway. For Celeste and her family, it felt like a small victory. Finally, the system was taking this seriously. Finally, there was something official, something with teeth that might make him stop. But intervention orders are only as effective as their enforcement, and they can only protect people if the person violating them is held accountable. Within a month of the intervention order being granted, Louis violated it. He sent Celeste a 3-page letter through Instagram. In it, he attempted to manipulate her, pleading with her to drop the charges against him, promising he would move on if she would just give him one more chance. The letter itself was a breach of the order. Celeste reported it immediately. Finally, police had concrete grounds to arrest him. In August 2020, Louis Sacco was taken into custody for breaching the intervention order. For Celeste and her family, there must have been a moment of relief. He was arrested. He was in custody. Surely, they thought, this would be the wake-up call he needed. Surely the consequences would make him realize he had to stop. But Louis was released within 24 hours. The day after his arrest, on August 15, 2020, Louis Sacco walked into a store and purchased a knife. He held on to it for 3 months. 3 months during which Celeste heard nothing from him. 3 months of eerie silence that might have felt like peace but was actually something far more sinister. It wasn't moving on. He was planning. During those 3 months, Celeste tried to reclaim some normalcy in her life. Her relationship with Chris was going well. She was continuing her studies. She was trying not to let fear rule her life. She deserved to feel safe, to go on dates, to share moments of happiness with the people she cared about. On the evening of November 14th, 2020, Celeste and Chris went out together. It was a good night, filled with the kind of easy joy that comes from being with someone you care about. Feeling happy and perhaps emboldened by the months of silence from her stalker, Celeste made a decision. She posted a photo to Instagram. It showed her and Chris together, their hands linked, smiling at the camera. It was the first time since the stalking began that she had posted a photo of herself with a man. For most people, sharing a photo with your boyfriend is a completely normal, unremarkable act. But for Celeste, it was a small declaration of independence, a refusal to let fear control her life. She couldn't have known that Loay was watching. She couldn't have known that seeing her with another man would be the trigger that pushed him over the edge. November 16. The early morning hours, that quiet space between late night and dawn when most of the world is sleeping. Celeste was asleep in her bedroom in her mother's house in Mernda. Her room was her sanctuary, decorated with the things that mattered to her, filled with memories and dreams. She was safe there, or at least she should have been. She was in her own home, surrounded by her family, protected by walls and locks, and an intervention order that was supposed to keep danger away. But at approximately 4:10 in the morning, Loay Sako drove to her family's home. He had been there before, driving past, studying the property, memorizing every detail. He knew exactly where he was going. He knew exactly what he planned to do. He came prepared. He brought a hammer and the knife he had purchased 3 months earlier. The night was quiet as he scaled the fence of the property. He moved with purpose towards Celeste's bedroom window. Using the hammer, he smashed through the glass. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence of the sleeping house. He climbed through the broken window into Celeste's room. She was asleep in her bed. She woke to find him standing over her. What happened next was brutal and swift. Loay attacked Celeste with the knife, stabbing her repeatedly. The assault lasted 2.5 minutes. In those 150 seconds, he stabbed her 23 times. 23 wounds for a 23-year-old woman whose only crime was being kind to someone who lost his job. Celeste fought for her life. The evidence would show that she didn't go quietly into that terrible night. She fought with everything she had, but it wasn't enough. When it was over, Loay dropped the knife on the bedroom floor and left the way he came, climbing back through the window and disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. The commotion woke Aggie. A mother's instinct, perhaps, or simply the sounds that no house should make in the middle of the night. She rushed down the hallway to her daughter's bedroom, moving as fast as she could, some part of her already knowing something terrible had happened, but not yet comprehending the full scope of the horror. She found Celeste in her bed surrounded by blood. Her beautiful daughter, the girl with the infectious laugh and the bright future, was gone. Aggie's screams must have torn through that house, through the neighborhood, through the fabric of everything normal and safe. In that moment, her world ended. Every parent's worst nightmare had become her reality. Emergency services were called. Police arrived to find a scene that would haunt the investigators who processed it. The bedroom was blood-spattered, violent, a stark contrast to what should have been a young woman's peaceful refuge. A few hours later, Loay Sako walked into the Mernda police station and turned himself in. He confessed to the murder, though when questioned about the details, he claimed his memory was fuzzy. He would later dispute the number of stab wounds, claiming he was only responsible for 2 of the 23. As if the math of it mattered, as if fewer wounds would somehow make the crime less heinous. As dawn broke on November 16, 2020, police began the grim work of investigating Celeste Mano's murder. The crime scene told a story of calculated violence. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion or a moment of lost control. This was premeditated, planned, executed with what the judge would later call chilling efficiency. Investigators discovered that Loay had used social media and online tools to stalk Celeste in ways that went beyond sending messages. He had cross-referenced her Instagram posts with Google Maps to determine her exact address. He had found floor plans of her house online, studying them to identify which room was hers. He had driven past the property multiple times in the weeks leading up to the murder, familiarizing himself with the neighborhood, the layout, the best approach. On November 18, 2 days after the murder, police confirmed the identity of the suspect. Loay Sako, 35 years old, from Roxburgh Park, the man who had worked with Celeste at the Circle call center more than a year earlier. The man who had been fired and couldn't let go. On November 19, he was formally charged with murder. As the case progressed through the legal system, Loay would attempt to delay proceedings, citing mental health issues. A forensic psychiatrist would eventually diagnose him with extreme personality disorder, major depressive disorder, and body dysmorphic disorder. The psychiatrist would testify that Loay's judgment was impaired at the time of the killing, though he was still capable of knowing the difference between right and wrong. These diagnoses would become crucial during sentencing, raising questions about culpability, rehabilitation, and what justice means when mental illness is a factor. But those legal proceedings were still years away. In the immediate aftermath of Celeste's death, her family was left to grapple with a grief so profound it defied words. Aggie DiMauro now carried a golden heart-shaped locket containing her daughter's ashes. It was a way to keep Celeste close, a physical reminder of a presence that should still be there but wasn't. The bond between mother and daughter hadn't been severed by death, but it had been irrevocably changed. All those moments Aggie had told Celeste how blessed she felt to be her mother. All those times Celeste had rolled her eyes affectionately and said, "Stop, Mom. You're my mom." Those were memories now, frozen in time, never to be added to or expanded upon. Alessandro had lost his big sister. Chris had lost his girlfriend. Colleagues had lost a friend. And the ripples of that loss extended outward, touching everyone who had known Celeste, everyone who had been brightened by her smile. But beyond the personal grief was something else, something that Aggie would channel into action. Rather than despair, there was rage. Rage at a system that had failed her daughter at every turn. In the months and years following Celeste's death, the failures became increasingly clear. Each one was a missed opportunity, a moment where intervention might have changed the outcome. The first failure was the initial police response. When Celeste first reported the stalking, she was dismissed. Officers told her that no crime had been committed yet, as if they needed to wait for violence before they could act. They advised her to get off social media, placing the burden of protection on the victim rather than the perpetrator. This response wasn't unique to Celeste's case. In 2022, the Victorian Law Reform Commission released a report that had been commissioned following Celeste's death. The report found that stalking allegations were routinely trivialized by Victorian police, with victims left to take out intervention orders themselves. Officers often dismiss or minimize victims' experience of stalking, and didn't always make formal records of reports. One victim told the commission, "The general reaction from police was that I was an older, anxious woman who lived alone and not worth their time, that I was wasting their time." Another said, "I am angry that other officers do not take stalking seriously and treat victims like they are behaving irrationally." The report described stalking as an invisible crime that was frequently not recognized by both police and people who experience it. It was often minimized or trivialized, and victim survivors were expected to manage the situation on their own. For Celeste, managing it on her own meant blocking lie repeatedly, changing her privacy settings, documenting every message, and persistently returning to police each time something new happened. It took a full year of harassment before she could obtain an intervention order. But that order, when it finally came, represented another failure. Intervention orders are meant to protect people, but they're only pieces of paper unless they're enforced. When Louis had breached the order by sending Celeste a 3-page letter, he was arrested, but then released within 24 hours. The day after his release, he bought the murder weapon. 3 months later, Celeste was dead. The system had numerous opportunities to intervene more forcefully. Electronic monitoring could have been imposed after the intervention order was breached. More stringent bail conditions could have kept him in custody longer. More serious criminal charges could have been filed earlier in the stalking process. But none of those things happened. Instead, a 23-year-old woman who did everything right, who reported the stalking, who sought legal protection, who documented every incident, ended up dead in her own bedroom. The statistics around stalking are sobering. In Victoria, more than 25,000 stalking offenses were reported to police in the 10 years leading up to 2020. Between 2021 and 2022, 1 in 6 women and 1 in 15 men reported being stalked. This includes unwanted contact online or by phone, loitering around homes or workplaces, following people in person, or tracking them electronically. But those are just the reported cases. Research suggests that almost half of all stalking victims never report the incidents, fearing that law enforcement won't take them seriously. Celeste's case proved that fear was justified. It would be more than 3 years before Louis Sacco was sentenced for Celeste's murder. The delays were partly due to questions about his mental state and fitness to stand trial. Forensic psychiatrists evaluated him, documenting his personality disorders and mental health issues. In April 2023, Louis finally pleaded guilty to murder. The plea hearing revealed the disturbing text messages he had sent to Celeste, providing a window into his obsessive mindset. During the hearing, prosecutor Patrick Bork detailed the calculated nature of the crime, The purchase of the knife the day after arrest. The use of Instagram and Google Earth to locate Celeste's home. The multiple drive-bys to familiarize himself with the property. The floor plan he found online. The targeting of her specific bedroom window. And the final trigger. The Instagram photo that Celeste posted on November 14, showing herself with her boyfriend for the first time. In Lou's jealous, obsessive mind, that photo was an unforgivable betrayal, even though Celeste owed him nothing, and had repeatedly told him to leave her alone. On February 29, 2024, Justice Jane Dixon handed down the sentence. The courtroom was filled with Celeste's family and supporters. Aggie DeMauro held the illuminated blue urn containing her daughter's ashes, clutching it tightly, waiting to hear what justice would look like for her daughter. 36 years in prison. Eligible for parole after 30. The courtroom erupted in tears and disbelief. Aggie and her family had been hoping for a life sentence. They believed that the premeditated nature of the crime, the prolonged stalking, the breach of the intervention order, and the utter lack of mercy shown to Celeste warranted the harshest possible punishment. But Justice Dixon, while acknowledging that this was a grave example of a grave offense, determined that it did not warrant a life sentence. She noted that Louis's prospects for rehabilitation were limited because he needed intensive psychiatric treatment that wasn't available in the prison system. But she was not persuaded that this would remain the case throughout his lengthy sentence. She acknowledged that Louis carried out the attack with chilling efficiency, and that his judgment was impaired, but not so impaired that he couldn't distinguish right from wrong. Celeste deserved life. Justice Dixon said to Louis, but you decided otherwise. Those words meant perhaps to convey the gravity of his crime, rang hollow to Celeste's family. Outside the courthouse, Aggie DeMauro faced the media. She was devastated but defiant. In her hand she held a speech she had prepared to read if the judge had handed down the life sentence she was hoping for. But that speech was now useless. She tore it up in front of the cameras. It's outrageous. Absolutely unbelievable that the court decided to grant him mercy even though he showed Celeste none, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Quite clearly, his right to mercy was more important than her right to life. She continued, today's outcome proves just how flawed the justice system is. We were forced to trust the system that we lost faith in 3 years ago. It failed Celeste then, and it failed her again now. Aggie had hoped that the Office of Public Prosecutions would appeal the sentence, seeking a harsher penalty, but that hope was dashed when they announced they would not pursue an appeal. The 36-year sentence would stand. This means that Louis Sacco, who was 39 years old at the time of sentencing, will be eligible for parole when he is 65. He has already served 3 years. In 2050, barring any changes, he could walk free. Celeste will still be dead. She will be forever 23, her life cut short, her potential unrealized, her family left to navigate decades without her. But Aggie DeMauro is not someone who accepts injustice quietly. In the years since her daughter's murder, she has become an advocate for change. She launched a petition calling for mandatory life sentences for murderers, arguing that it is the strongest way to denounce the crime. Life for a life, the petition states simply. She's calling on the Victorian government to implement all 45 recommendations from the stalking report commissioned after Celeste's death. Many of those recommendations remain unimplemented years later, despite promises from multiple attorneys general. She's advocating for electronic monitoring of stalking offenders, believing that if Louis had been monitored after breaching the intervention order, he never would have had the opportunity to murder her daughter. She's pushing for stronger laws against stalking and violence, especially towards women, and for a fundamental change in how law enforcement responds to stalking reports. In March 2024, more than 100 supporters joined Aggie and her son Alessandro on a march through Melbourne. They wore t-shirts emblazoned with Justice for Celeste and held flyers as they walked down Bourke Street Mall to the Supreme Court. 23 Harley-Davidsons roared alongside them, one for each year of Celeste's life. The noise was deafening, impossible to ignore. That's the point, Aggie would say. Celeste's death shouldn't be ignored. The system's failure shouldn't be ignored. The epidemic of stalking shouldn't be ignored. When a tragedy like Celeste's murder occurs, it's natural to ask, could it have been prevented? And if the answer is yes, then the follow-up question becomes unbearable. Why wasn't it? Every step of the way there were opportunities for intervention. If police had taken Celeste's initial reports more seriously, if the stalking laws had been stronger and more clearly defined, if Louis had been held in custody after breaching the intervention order, if electronic monitoring had been mandated, if the psychiatric issues had been identified and treated earlier, any one of those interventions might have changed the outcome, might have kept Celeste alive, but they didn't happen. And now she's gone, and the family is left with nothing but questions and grief and anger. There's also the question of mental illness. Loe Sacco was diagnosed with severe personality disorder, major depressive disorder, and body dysmorphic disorder. These are real conditions that can significantly impair judgment and behavior, but they don't absolve him of responsibility. Many people live with mental illness without becoming stalkers or murderers. The vast majority of people with these diagnoses never harm anyone. Mental illness may explain behavior, but it doesn't excuse it, and in this case the question remains. If Louis's mental health was so severely compromised, why was he released after breaching the intervention order? Why wasn't he mandated to receive treatment? Why were his clear warning signs not enough to trigger more intensive intervention? These questions haunt Aggie DeMauro. She's left wondering how many chances the system had to save her daughter and why none of them were taken. The story of Celeste Mano is a tragedy. But it's not just a tragedy, it's a call to action. It's a reminder that when someone tells you they're being stalked, you should believe them. When someone seeks help from law enforcement, that help should be given, fully and without hesitation. When protective orders are issued, they should be enforced rigorously. It's a reminder that kindness should never be punished, that posting photos on social media should never cost you your life, that doing everything right should actually protect you. Most of all, it's a reminder that behind every statistic, every case number, every news headline, there's a person, a real human being, with people who love them and a future that should have been theirs to live. Celeste Mano was that person. She was 23 years old, with a smile you could see from a mile away and a laugh that was infectious when she got going. She studied criminology and psychology because she wanted to understand why people did terrible things, never imagining she would become the victim of the very crime she was studying. She did everything right. She reported the stalking. She blocked her harasser. She sought legal protection. She documented everything, and it wasn't enough. The system failed her at every turn, and on November 16th, 2020, she paid for those failures with her life. But Aggie DeMauro carries that illuminated blue urn with her daughter's ashes, and she continues to fight. She fights so that other mothers don't have to experience what she's experienced. She fights so that Celeste's name becomes synonymous, not just with tragedy, but with change. Celeste deserved life, the judge said. She did. She deserved the life that stretched out before her, full of possibility and promise. She deserved to age and grow and experience all the moments that were stolen from her. What Celeste got instead was a system that minimized her fears, dismissed her concerns, and failed to protect her when she needed it most. What she got was a man who couldn't accept rejection, who turned kindness into obsession, and who decided that if he couldn't have her, no one could. But what Celeste also gets is a mother who refuses to let her death be in vain, who turns grief into action, pain into purpose, who makes sure that every time someone speaks about stalking reform in Victoria, they say her daughter's name, Celeste Mano. Remember it. Remember her. Remember that she was more than a victim, more than a cautionary tale, more than a statistic. She was a young woman who loved cheerleading and psychology, who had an infectious smile and a bright future, who was kind even when kindness put her in danger. Remember that her death was preventable. Remember that the system had countless opportunities to save her, and didn't take them. Remember that intervention orders are just pieces of paper, unless they're enforced with the seriousness they deserve. And if you or someone you know is being stalked, remember this. You deserve to be taken seriously. Your fear is valid. Your experience matters. Don't stop reporting. Don't stop documenting. Don't stop seeking help, even when the system seems indifferent. Because change is coming, slowly but surely. Because of Celeste, because of Aggie's tireless advocacy, because of all the other victims and families who refuse to be silent. The conversation around stalking is shifting. It's not enough yet. The laws still need strengthening. The police response still needs improving. The cultural attitudes still need changing. But it's a start. And somewhere, perhaps, Celeste knows that her mother hasn't stopped fighting for her. That her death, while tragic and preventable and absolutely unforgivable, has sparked a movement that might save others. That infectious laugh is silent now. That bright smile is gone. But the impact of her life and the outrage over her death continues to echo. Rest peacefully, Celeste Mono. Your mother carries you with her. Your story will not be forgotten. And the fight for justice, for change, for a system that actually protects people like you, continues in your name. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we'll explore a story about a young girl who disappeared one foggy morning in Northern California. A case that would grip an entire community and expose a predator hiding in plain sight. We'll walk through the events of March 16, 2012, and the investigation that followed. Sierra Mae Lamar was born on October 19, 1996, in Fremont, California. She was the younger of two daughters born to Steve and Marlene Lamar. Those who knew Sierra described her as vibrant, funny, and impossibly kind. She had one of those personalities that made people feel seen, that made them laugh even on their worst days. At Washington High School in Fremont, where she spent her freshman year, Sierra was a cheerleader. She loved competitive dance. She had a wide circle of friends who adored her. But in October of 2011, everything changed. Sierra's parents had divorced, and her mother Marlene made the decision to move to Morgan Hill with her new boyfriend, Rick Gardiner. For Sierra, this meant leaving behind everything she knew, leaving her father Steve in Fremont, leaving her friends, leaving the halls of Washington High where she'd built her world. The move was hard on her. Morgan Hill was rural, quiet, surrounded by farm fields and rolling hills. At Ancebrado High School, she was the new girl who knew no one. But Sierra was adaptable. Slowly, over those first few months, she began to make friends. She started to settle in. Her older sister Danielle, who was away at Sacramento State University, noticed the change when they talked on the phone. Sierra seemed happier. She was bringing up her grades. She was talking about getting highlights in her hair. Excited about small things again. The family had rented a ranch-style house on Paquito Espana Court, a quiet cul-de-sac at the end of a rural road. The bus stop was just down the street at the intersection of Palm Avenue and Doherty Avenue, surrounded by open fields. Every morning, Sierra would walk that short distance to catch the bus to school. It should have been safe. It should have been routine. That Friday morning started like any other in the Lamar household. Rick Gardiner left for his construction job around 6 in the morning. Marlene kissed her daughter goodbye and headed to her own job in Fremont. Sierra, 15 years old and still adjusting to this new life, got ready for school in the quiet house. At 6:29 a.m., Sierra sent a tweet to a friend. She posted a picture on social media. She gathered her things, her black Samsung Galaxy phone, which was practically attached to her hand, her Juicy Couture bag, her books. She dressed in jeans, a San Jose Sharks sweatshirt, and headed out the door. The plan was simple: walk to the bus stop, catch the bus that arrived at 7:15, get to school. But Sierra never made it to the bus. The fog was thick that morning, the kind of fog that blankets rural California and turns familiar roads into something strange and uncertain. The walk from her house to the bus stop was less than half a mile, mostly along quiet roads bordered by fields. Somewhere in that short walk, Sierra Lamar vanished. At first, the school's automated systems simply logged her as absent. These systems send out notifications, impersonal digital messages, that a student hasn't shown up. When Marlene received that notification, she called Sierra's phone. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. Marlene left work early and drove to Morgan Hill. When she got home, Sierra wasn't there. She went to the school. Sierra had never arrived. The worry that had been building in her chest turned into something cold and heavy. At 3:45 p.m., Marlene called the police and reported her daughter missing. The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department began by reviewing the bus surveillance footage. It confirmed what Marlene already knew in her heart. Sierra had never boarded the bus that morning. They checked the footage from previous days, looking for any pattern, any person who might have been watching her. Nothing stood out. The next day, March 17th, deputies began searching the fields around Sierra's route to the bus stop. In a muddy field along Palm Avenue, about 3/4 of a mile from her house, they found her phone. It looked like it had been thrown, discarded carelessly in the dirt. For investigators, this was the moment the case changed. Teenagers might run away. They might skip school, but they don't leave their phones behind. Not in 2012, when those phones were their connection to everything that mattered. On March 18th, searchers found something else. Behind a shed on Laguna Avenue, several miles from Sierra's home, they discovered her juicy couture bag wedged between the building and a cactus. Inside were her clothes neatly folded, her jeans, her San Jose Sharks sweatshirt, her shirt, her bra, her underwear. The jeans were covered in dirt. The pattern of the dirt suggested something horrifying. Someone had dragged Sierra by her feet, her back scraping along the ground. By now, the community was mobilizing. Hundreds of volunteers began showing up to search for Sierra. Flyers went up all over the Bay Area. At Washington High School in Fremont, Sierra's former classmates covered the walls with missing posters. Her friends were adamant Sierra wouldn't run away. If she'd wanted to leave Morgan Hill, she would have come back to Fremont, to them, to her father. The case made national news. America's Most Wanted featured Sierra's story. But as the days turned into weeks, the awful truth began to settle over everyone. Sierra wasn't missing. Sierra was gone. The Santa Clara County Crime Lab processed everything they'd recovered. The phone, the bag, the clothes. When they tested Sierra's genes, they found something. Trace DNA, touch DNA, small amounts of genetic material that didn't belong to Sierra. They ran it through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that law enforcement uses to match unknown DNA to known offenders. They got a hit. The DNA belonged to a man named Antolin Garcia Torres. He was 21 years old. He worked at a Safeway grocery store in Morgan Hill. He lived about 7 miles from Sierra's bus stop, in a trailer park with his mother, his pregnant girlfriend, and their toddler daughter. And his DNA was in the system because of a previous crime, felony battery resulting in serious bodily injury. Detectives pulled his records. Garcia Torres drove a red Volkswagen Jetta with a black hood. When they pulled surveillance footage from the trailer park where he lived, they found something chilling. Garcia Torres had left home in his Jetta at around 7 a.m. on March 16th, just 15 minutes before Sierra would have left her house. But the detectives didn't arrest him, not yet. They needed more. They needed to understand what had happened to Sierra, and they hoped desperately that Garcia Torres might lead them to her. On March 28, 2012, 12 days after Sierra disappeared, the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department began 24-hour surveillance of Antolin Garcia Torres. Multiple agencies were involved. They watched his every move. They tracked his car with a GPS device. They followed him to work, to the store, everywhere. On April 4th, detectives brought Garcia Torres in for questioning. They didn't tell him they'd found the DNA match. They just asked him about Sierra Lamar, showed him her picture, asked if he knew her. Garcia Torres said no. He'd never seen her before, never heard of her, didn't know her, never went to school with her, didn't have any friends in common. The only time he'd seen her face, he claimed, was on the news after she went missing. Then unsolicited, he began to explain things. He started volunteering information the detectives hadn't asked for. He told them he'd gone fishing on the morning of March 16th, alone at the Uvas Reservoir. He described taking an unusual route, one that happened to go near Palm Avenue, where Sierra had disappeared, but he insisted he'd never crossed paths with her. Never seen her, never had any contact with her whatsoever. The detectives let him go, but they knew they had something. Garcia Torres had just lied, and he'd tried to explain away evidence before the detectives had even told him what evidence they had. On April 7th, 2012, investigators seized Garcia Torres' red Volkswagen Jetta. They took it apart piece by piece, looking for evidence. They found it. Sierra's DNA was on the inside door handle of the passenger side. Her fingerprints were on the rear door, and in the trunk wrapped around a rope was a single strand of Sierra's hair. The back of the trunk also contained black polyester fibers that matched fibers found on Sierra's clothing. And throughout the car, they found biological evidence belonging to Garcia Torres himself. Evidence that suggested something terrible had happened in that vehicle. But there was more. Investigators kept digging into Garcia Torres' background. They found purchases he'd made 3 days before Sierra disappeared. Bleach and a turkey baster. They found his work records at Safeway. They looked at his Safeway rewards card and began tracking his movements. And that's when they discovered something that turned the case from tragic to terrifying. In 2009, 3 years before Sierra disappeared, 3 different women had been attacked in the parking lot of the Morgan Hill Safeway, where Garcia Torres worked. The first attack happened on March 21, 2009. A woman was walking to her car when a man came up behind her and shot her with a stun gun. She fought him off. He ran. In her car, investigators found the stun gun he'd dropped. On the battery inside the stun gun, they found a fingerprint. That fingerprint belonged to Antolin Garcia Torres. 2 more women reported similar attacks. A man approaching them in the parking lot. Attempts to force them into vehicles. It escaped, but the pattern was clear. Garcia Torres was a predator. He'd been escalating. The attacks had grown bolder, more violent. And then, in 2012, he'd found Sierra Lamar walking alone on a foggy morning. For 2 months, investigators watched Garcia Torres. They hoped he'd make a mistake. Hoped he'd lead them to wherever he'd hidden Sierra's body. But he didn't. He went to work. He came home. He acted like nothing had happened. On May 21, 2012, 66 days after Sierra disappeared, the surveillance ended. Detectives made the call. They weren't going to find Sierra's body this way. It was time to make the arrest. That afternoon, Garcia Torres was working at the Safeway in Morgan Hill when sheriff's deputies walked in. They arrested him in front of customers, in front of his co-workers, and charged him with the kidnapping and murder of Sierra Lamar. The news hit the community like a wave. Finally, there was a suspect. Finally, there was someone to hold accountable for the nightmare that had consumed Morgan Hill for more than 2 months. But there was no body, no crime scene, no murder weapon, no confession. The prosecution would have to prove that Sierra was dead, and that Garcia Torres had killed her, based entirely on forensic evidence and circumstantial proof. Garcia Torres pleaded not guilty. His mother insisted he was innocent. His attorneys argued that the prosecution's case was built on sloppy lab work and contaminated evidence. They claimed there was an innocent explanation for everything, that Sierra was a missing person, not a murder victim, and that Garcia Torres had nothing to do with her disappearance. The district attorney's office saw it differently. In May 2014, Santa Clara County District Attorney Jeff Rosen announced that prosecutors would seek the death penalty against Garcia Torres. It was the first death penalty case Rosen had pursued since taking office in 2011. While the legal system ground slowly forward through delays and hearings and motions, the Lamar family lived in a kind of suspended agony. They organized search parties every weekend. Hundreds of volunteers showed up. People who'd never met Sierra but couldn't bear the thought of her out there somewhere, unfound. On March 14, 2015, 3 years after Sierra disappeared, the family made one of the hardest decisions of their lives. They announced that day would be the last officially organized search for Sierra's body. They hadn't given up hope. They would never give up hope. But they needed to face the reality that Sierra might never be found. That Garcia Torres might take the location of her remains to his grave. Steve Lamar, Sierra's father, spoke to reporters about those years. He'd been ruled out as a suspect early in the investigation, despite having a criminal record that he'd openly disclosed to police. He'd cooperated fully, and he'd watched helplessly as the case against Garcia Torres built slowly, agonizingly toward trial. Not knowing what happened is the most frustrating part. Steve said on the 2nd anniversary of Sierra's disappearance, "A part of me really wants to believe that Sierra was kidnapped and is still alive." Marlene Lamar, Sierra's mother, held on to her own kind of hope. She attended every court hearing. She faced the man accused of killing her daughter over and over in those sterile courtrooms. And Sierra's older sister Danielle, who talked to Sierra on speakerphone the night before she disappeared. would hurt her excitement about getting highlights in her hair, carried the weight of being the sibling left behind. In October 2016, jury selection finally began. The trial itself started in January 2017, nearly 5 years after Sierra disappeared. Deputy District Attorney David Boyd laid out the prosecution's case methodically. He presented the DNA evidence. Garcia Torres' DNA on Sierra's jeans. Sierra's DNA in Garcia Torres' car. Her hair on the rope in his trunk. The black polyester fibers that matched. The timeline that put Garcia Torres in his car, leaving home just minutes before Sierra would have left hers. Boyd presented evidence of the 2009 attacks, arguing that they showed a pattern, a method of operation. Garcia Torres was a sexual predator who targeted young women. He'd been escalating. The Safeway attacks had failed, but with Sierra, alone on a foggy road, he'd succeeded. Boyd argued that Garcia Torres had seen his opportunity that morning. He'd driven past Sierra as she walked to the bus stop. He'd stopped. Maybe he'd asked for directions. Maybe he'd offered her a ride. However it happened, he'd gotten her into his car. And then, Boyd argued, Garcia Torres had assaulted and killed her. He'd stripped her body. He'd hidden her remains somewhere in the vast rural areas around Morgan Hill. He'd discarded her clothes, trying to stage it to look like she'd run away. But he'd made mistakes. He'd left his DNA. He'd left her hair in his car. He tried to explain things to investigators before he knew what evidence they had. The defense attorney, Alfonso Lopez, attacked every piece of evidence. He argued that the DNA could have been transferred innocently, that the crime lab had mishandled evidence, that touch DNA was unreliable, that without a body, without a crime scene, without a weapon, without a confession, the prosecution couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Sierra was even dead, much less that Garcia Torres had killed her. For 3 months, the trial continued. 50 witnesses testified. Sierra's mother gave emotional testimony about her daughter, about that terrible day, about the years of waiting for answers. On May 2, 2017, the attorneys gave their closing arguments. David Boyd told the jury about a calculating predator who'd grown in sophistication from his failed 2009 attacks. When he saw Sierra Lamar that March morning, Boyd argued, Garcia Torres saw what he wanted. And this time he got it. Her rotting remains are out there, never to be found, Boyd told the jury. But they would give a window into what he did to her. You don't need to strip her naked to kill her. You need to strip her body because you want her body. Lopez, the defense attorney, made one final plea for the jury to consider reasonable doubt, to question the evidence, to acknowledge that without a body, they were being asked to convict based on incomplete proof. On May 4, 2017, the jury began deliberations. 2 days. That's how long the jury took to reach their decision. On May 9, 2017, the courtroom in San Jose was packed. Sierra's family sat in the front row, Steve and Marlene holding giant photographs of their daughter. Garcia Torres stood beside his attorneys, wearing a light blue collared shirt and tie. The verdict came just after 9 a.m. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of 3 counts of attempted kidnapping related to the 2009 Safeway attacks. Sierra's family erupted in gasps of relief. Marlene began to cry. Steve held his daughters close. Outside the courthouse, Marlene spoke to reporters through her tears. We've been praying for this ending, for justice, she said. It gives us peace to know this will not happen to another family. Garcia Torres showed almost no reaction. He stood still, expressionless, as the verdicts were read. The penalty phase of the trial began a week later. The prosecution still sought the death penalty. The defense presented evidence about Garcia Torres' terrible childhood. His father was in prison for sexually abusing Garcia Torres' sister for years. Garcia Torres had grown up in poverty, in neglect, exposed to violence and abuse. But the jury wasn't swayed. On June 5, 2017, they unanimously decided against the death penalty. Instead, Garcia Torres would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. The formal sentencing hearing took place on December 12, 2017. It had been delayed for months while the defense challenged the judge on conflict of interest grounds. But finally the day arrived. Steve and Marlene Lamar both gave victim impact statements. They spoke directly to Garcia Torres, holding up photographs of Sierra, forcing him to see her face. "You have ruined our family," Steve told them. "You have taken away life's most precious gift. A child. I can only hope that your time in prison will be a living hell." Marlene stood at the witness stand so she could face Garcia Torres directly. "I find it incomprehensible that you can make a choice to perform a heinous crime, to rape and murder a child," she said. "You have robbed Sierra of what God had planned for her." Throughout both statements, Garcia Torres looked down. He avoided eye contact. He said nothing. Judge Vanessa Zecker formally sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Garcia Torres was transferred to Corcoran State Prison in Central California, where he remains today. And still, to this day, he has never said where Sierra's body is. In 2022, a reporter from Catron 4 named Amy Larson sent a handwritten letter to Garcia Torres at Corcoran State Prison. She asked him 4 questions. She asked about his life in prison. She asked about his family. She asked if anyone visited him. And she asked if he still maintained his innocence. Garcia Torres wrote back. It was the first time he'd responded to any reporter. He answered only one question. "Yes. Amy, I hold fast to my innocence," he wrote. He refused to address any specifics about the case. He wrote about his mistrust of the media, about selective reporting, about how answering certain questions might start shit with others. "I'm just gonna do my time," he wrote. He never mentioned Sierra. He never said where her body is. He never provided the one piece of information that might give her family the closure they so desperately need. Even now, more than a decade after Sierra disappeared, volunteers still search for her, not with the massive organized efforts of those first years, but quietly, persistently. People who never met Sierra but can't let go of the hope that someday, somehow, she'll be found and brought home. Steve Lamar has said that he still hopes they'll find her. To be able to get that closure would be good, he told reporters on the 10th anniversary of her disappearance. But he's also learned to live with the possibility that they never will. "We just kind of remember it," he said quietly. "It's hard for Marlene and Danielle and I. The family has shifted their focus to remembering Sierra's life rather than dwelling on her death. They talk about her smile, her generosity, her ability to make people laugh. Her friends still gather every March to remember her. There's a search center in Morgan Hill that for years served as the hub for volunteers looking for Sierra. It's mostly closed now, but the memories remain. The flyers, the maps marked with search grids, the photographs of a beautiful 15-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her. Sierra May Lamar would be 31 years old now if she'd lived. She might have finished college, started a career, fallen in love, had children of her own. All the futures that were stolen from her on that foggy morning in 2012. There are still so many questions in this case. What exactly happened in those moments when Garcia Torres encountered Sierra? How did he get her into his car? Did he use the stun gun like he had with the women at Safeway? Did he threaten her? Did she try to run?
Where's her body?
The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department used dive teams to search every reservoir and lake around Morgan Hill. Volunteers combed thousands of acres of fields and hills. The FBI assisted. They used ground-penetrating radar. They chased down hundreds of tips, but Sierra has never been found. Did Garcia Torres act alone, or was someone else involved? The investigation never found evidence of an accomplice. But the question lingers. And perhaps the biggest question, why? What was it about that particular morning, that particular girl that made Garcia Torres choose her? These questions haunt the people who work the case. The detectives who spend years tracking every lead. The prosecutors who built the case without a body. The volunteers who gave up weekends to search fields in the hot California sun. But they also haunt Sierra's family, who live every day with the absence of answers, with the empty space where their daughter and sister should be. Sierra's case changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases in California. The massive community response, the sustained search efforts, the use of forensic DNA evidence to secure a conviction without a body, all of it became a template for future cases. The case also highlighted the importance of DNA databases. Garcia Torres' DNA was in CAUDIS because of his previous felony assault conviction. Without that, investigators might never have identified him. It's a reminder of why these databases exist, why they matter. For the Morgan Hill community, Sierra's disappearance was a loss of innocence. This was a quiet rural area where people didn't lock their doors, where teenagers walked to bus stops without fear. After March 16, 2012, that changed. Parents drove their kids to school. People looked differently at strangers. The sense of safety that had defined the community was shattered. But there was also something else. A sense of unity. The hundreds of people who searched for Sierra, the businesses that donated supplies, the strangers who showed up week after week, just to help. In the darkest moment, the community came together. As we close this story tonight, let yourself think about Sierra, not about what happened to her in those final moments, but about who she was. A 15-year-old girl who loved to dance, who made her friends laugh, who was working to bring up her grades, who wanted blonde highlights in her hair. She was excited about a research paper. She tweeted her friends. She was normal and happy and full of potential. What happened to Sierra could have happened to anyone. That's what makes it so terrifying. She was just walking to the bus stop, doing what thousands of teenagers do every morning. She had no way of knowing that a predator had seen her, had chosen her, had been waiting for his moment. The failure wasn't Sierra's. The failure was in a system that allowed Garcia Torres to attack 3 women in 2009 and remain free to attack again. The failure was in the random chance that put him on that road at that moment. But the success, if we can call it that, was in the community that refused to give up on finding her, in the investigators who built an airtight case without the evidence they normally rely on, in the jury that delivered justice, even without a body, in the family that survived the unsurvivable and found a way to keep living, to keep hoping, to keep Sierra's memory alive. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that Sierra's story isn't really over. Somewhere out there, her body rests in an unmarked place. Her family still hopes that someday, somehow, she'll be found and finally brought home. Antolin Garcia Torres sits in a cell at Corkin State Prison, serving out his life sentence. He maintains his innocence. He refuses to speak about what happened. And so the final chapter of Sierra's story remains unwritten. But we remember her. We tell her story. We honor the bright, kind, funny girl she was. We hope that someday the last piece of the puzzle will fall into place and Sierra May Lamar will finally be at peace. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Sometimes the most devastating tragedies emerge, not from elaborate criminal schemes or calculated plots, but from the smallest, most mundane irritations of everyday life. Tonight's story takes us to a quiet village in Somerset, England, where a parking dispute between neighbors escalated into an act so violent, so final, that it would shatter multiple families and leave 2 young boys without their parents. This is the story of Stephen and Jennifer Chappell, and the neighbor who climbed a fence one November evening and changed everything forever. Norton Fitzwarren sits just outside Taunton in Somerset, one of those English villages that embodies a particular kind of peaceful rural life. The kind of place where people move specifically to escape the chaos of cities, where children can play safely in the streets, and where neighbors generally know each other by name. In 2018, a new housing development called Dragon Rise was built in the village. Like many modern developments across Britain, it consisted of neat rows of semi-detached and terraced homes, affordable for young families but not particularly spacious. Each property came with just one designated parking space, which would prove to be more significant than anyone could have imagined. The development attracted exactly the kind of residents you'd expect. Young professionals, growing families, people taking their first steps onto the property ladder. Among them were 2 families who would become neighbors, sharing a fence line, living just meters apart. Their lives would become entangled in the most tragic way imaginable. Stephen Chappell was 36 years old, a teacher who worked at West Somerset College. His wife Jennifer was 33, and worked at a local cafe in a nearby garden center. They had married in 2018, and together they were raising 2 young sons, aged 5 and 6. By all accounts, they were devoted parents. Jennifer's sister, Rhonda Godley, would later describe them as wonderful parents, whose love for their children was incredible. They were the kind of couple who lived for their boys, who put their children at the center of everything they did. Jennifer's mother, Ann Clayton, remembered her daughter as an exuberant, caring, beautiful light in the world. Friends and co-workers spoke of Jennifer's warmth, her quick smile, the way she could brighten a room simply by being in it. Stephen was remembered as dedicated, conscientious, the kind of teacher who genuinely cared about his students. They had moved into their home on Dragon Rise a few years earlier, settling into the rhythms of suburban family life. The house wasn't large, but it was theirs. They had their designated parking space, a small garden where the boys could play, neighbors on either side. It was meant to be a place where they could build their future, where their sons could grow up with memories of safety and happiness. They had no way of knowing that something as ordinary as a parking space would become the catalyst for unspeakable tragedy. Next door lived Colin Reeves. He was 35 years old, a former soldier who had served in the British Army between 2002 and 2017. Reeves had been a member of the Royal Engineers and had completed the grueling commando training. He had served in Afghanistan, experiencing the kind of combat that leaves marks, visible and invisible. When soldiers leave the military, they're given ceremonial gifts to mark their service. Reeves had received a ceremonial dagger when he left the army, a gleaming blade in an ornate sheath, the kind of thing meant to be displayed in a frame on a wall, a memento of service and sacrifice. He kept it in his home, mounted in a picture frame alongside photographs from his military days. After leaving the army, Reeves had settled into civilian life, or at least tried to. He was married to Kaylee, and they had 2 children of their own. He worked as a lorry driver, navigating the sometimes difficult transition from military structure to civilian employment. Like the Chapels, they had moved to Dragon Rise seeking a quiet, stable life for their family. At first, the relationship between the 2 families seemed cordial enough. They were neighbors in the way many people on new housing estates are neighbors. Friendly but not necessarily friends, waving and passing, exchanging pleasantries about the weather or the children. But something would change that dynamic entirely. Something small. Something that in another context would seem almost laughably trivial. The trouble began when Jennifer Chappell learned to drive and bought a second car on a development where each home had only one designated parking space. This created an immediate problem. There simply wasn't enough space for everyone's vehicles, and the roads were narrow, making parking on the street a contentious issue. The court would later hear that the Chappells and Reeves had initially had a good relationship, but it deteriorated after Mrs. Chappell bought her second car, sparking rows over parking spaces. It's worth pausing here to understand something about these housing developments. Residents on the estate said disputes over parking were common because of narrow roads and the lack of parking space. Many people had more than one car because public transport in the area was inadequate. There were always issues between neighbors about cars blocking drives or being parked outside homes. This wasn't unique to the Chappells and Reeves. It was a simmering tension that affected multiple households. But something about this particular dispute felt different. It began to escalate in ways that went beyond normal neighborly irritation. During one confrontation on May 15, Reeves approached Mrs. Chappell in her car, telling her, "You can't park here," as she positioned herself near a graveled area outside his home. "You don't own the road," Miss Chappell told him, before he moved around to the front of the vehicle and continued confronting her. The tension continued to build through the summer and into autumn of 2021. Then on November 11, just 10 days before the murders, something happened that would prove significant. The Chappell's doorbell camera captured an incident where Reeves verbally abused Jennifer outside her house. He called her a finky and "you fat bitch." The footage is difficult to watch. There's real venom in his voice, a level of anger that seems disproportionate to a parking disagreement. Jennifer Chappell was very scared after this incident. She told a coworker, Sandrine Moreira, that she was afraid. She knew Reeves would kill her if she said or did anything against him. She knew he was ex-military. Think about that for a moment. Jennifer Chappell told someone she feared her neighbor might kill her. She expressed this fear explicitly. And yet, what could she do? She lived next door to him. She couldn't simply move. She had to navigate her daily life, knowing that on the other side of the fence was someone she genuinely feared. The parking dispute had transformed from a neighborhood annoyance into something darker, more ominous. But even then, even with Jennifer's expressed fears, no one could have predicted what was about to happen. November 21st. 2021 started as a Sunday like any other in Norton Fitzwarren. As evening approached, families were settling into their routines. Children were being put to bed. The chapel boys aged 5 and 6 were tucked in upstairs, drifting off to sleep in their bedrooms, unaware that they would never see their parents alive again. In the Reeves household next door, a different kind of tension was building. Colin Reeves was having trouble in his marriage. That evening, his wife Kaylee told him she wanted a trial separation. For Reeves, this must have felt like his world was collapsing. He would later claim he feared losing everything. The military structure he'd known for 15 years was long gone. His marriage was now crumbling, and there, on the other side of the fence, were the Chapels, who in his mind had been making his life difficult for months with their parking. Something in Reeves snapped. Just minutes after the conversation with his wife, Reeves walked to the picture frame where his ceremonial dagger was displayed. He took the blade out of the frame. His wife would notice it was missing when she heard screaming, and realized what was happening. The chapel's home was equipped with security cameras, including one at the back door. The footage would later show Reeves climbing the fence that separated his garden from the chapel's, entering their property through the back garden. It was around 9:45 p.m. Stephen and Jennifer were in their living room, probably winding down from the day, perhaps watching television, certainly not expecting what was about to happen. The backdoor camera captured Reeves entering through the door. What happened next was captured on audio, and it's almost unbearable to contemplate. A few seconds after Reeves entered, Jennifer Chapel could be heard screaming in terror. Reeves was shouting, "Die, youth." The attack lasted approximately 1 minute. 1 minute in which Colin Reeves, trained in combat, wielding a military blade, destroyed 2 lives and orphaned 2 children. Jennifer suffered 6 stab wounds to her upper chest and shoulder, causing fatal injuries to a major blood vessel in her heart. She didn't even have a chance to stand up from the sofa to defend herself. Stephen received 6 stab wounds as well, along with 3 other minor injuries. He was found close to the rear door. Perhaps he had tried to reach the back door to escape or get help. We'll never know exactly what happened in those final moments. Neither victim had defensive injuries, indicating the shocking speed and ferocity of the attack. Upstairs, the chapel boys slept through it all, their dreams undisturbed, unaware that their mother and father were dying just 1 floor below them. After the attack, Reeves climbed back over the fence and telephoned the police. The killer himself called 999 to inform authorities of his crime, just minutes after committing the murders. In the recording of that call, Reeves told the operator he had stabbed his neighbors. He said he had gone round with a knife and stabbed them a couple of times each. There's something chilling about the matter-of-fact way he described what he'd done, as if he was reporting a minor incident rather than a double homicide. In the background of the 999 call, Reeves could be heard telling someone, believed to be his mother, "I couldn't let her or them torment Kaylee anymore." Even in that moment, he was framing his actions as somehow protective, as if the Chapels had left him no choice. When police arrived at the scene, they found Stephen and Jennifer Chapel dead in their home, and upstairs still sleeping peacefully, they found 2 little boys who had just become orphans. The children, aged 5 and 6, were found asleep in the upstairs of the house. When officers arrived, the couple's children were still asleep. Officers carefully carried the boys out of the house so they wouldn't have to see anything. They were taken into the care of family members, spared the immediate horror but not the lifelong impact of what had happened. In one sense, there wasn't much investigation needed. Reeves had confessed immediately. He was arrested at the scene and taken into custody. But what unfolded in the following months was an attempt to understand not just what happened, but why. How does a parking dispute escalate to double murder? What was going through Reeves's mind? And could anything have been done to prevent it? At the police station, Reeves appeared confused. He gave his name as Lance Corporal Reeves, sir, and provided his service number. He seemed to be slipping back into his military identity, perhaps trying to make sense of what he'd done through that familiar framework. Reeves confessed to the crime, claiming he suffered from an abnormality of mental functioning at the time of the killings. His defense would argue that he was suffering from diminished responsibility due to his mental health, particularly related to his military service. Reeves claims that he suffered from paranoia about CCTV cameras after allegedly being under surveillance during his army days. He said he remembered noticing a white light, which he believed to be the chapel's security light, and that white light was a trigger when I was a soldier. His defense team would argue that his time in Afghanistan had left deep psychological scars, that he had been bottling up his feelings since leaving the service, and that this had contributed to his actions that night. But the prosecution's psychiatric experts told a different story. Two forensic psychiatrists examined Reeves and concluded he was not suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or psychosis. They diagnosed him with moderate and mild depression, respectively. Both psychiatrists said he could be suffering from dissociative amnesia, a condition common in perpetrators of domestic homicide when they are unable to process what they have done. In other words, his claimed lack of memory might be his mind's way of protecting him from the full horror of his actions, not evidence of diminished responsibility at the time. The prosecution's psychiatric expert, Dr. John Sanford, said, "This has nothing to do with depression. It's a reaction to a traumatic act, something that is usually a reaction to something you've done rather than something done to you." Colin Reeves admitted to manslaughter but denied murder, claiming he was suffering from diminished responsibility at the time. The question for the jury wasn't whether he killed the Chappells, he had confessed to that immediately, but whether his mental state was so impaired that he couldn't be held fully responsible for murder. The trial took place at Bristol Crown Court in June 2022, 7 months after the killings. For the families of Stephen and Jennifer, it was an agonizing experience. In a statement, the families said, "If anything, these past 10 days have prolonged us finding out how Jennifer and Stephen spent their final moments. They had to sit through the reconstruction of that terrible night, listening to the audio recordings, viewing the security footage, confronting again and again the violence that had been inflicted on their loved ones." The doorbell camera footage was shown to the jury. The clip was so upsetting that many of the victims' family members chose to leave the courtroom before it was played. They couldn't bear to hear Jennifer's screams, to hear Reeves shouting those terrible words. The evidence was overwhelming. The premeditation was clear. Reeves had removed his ceremonial dagger from its frame. The violence was extreme. 12 stab wounds between two victims, plus additional injuries. The victims were unarmed, caught off guard, given no chance to defend themselves. After deliberating for 5 hours and 21 minutes, the jury rejected his defense and accepted the prosecution's case that his actions were deliberate. They found him guilty of 2 counts of murder. Reeves showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read out, but his wife Kaylee wept in the courtroom. Their own children were now effectively without a father, not because he had died, but because he had chosen to commit murder. On June 21, 2022, Colin Reeves was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 38 years before he could be considered for parole. The judge, Mr. Justice Garnham, said the killings had torn the heart out of 2 perfectly normal, decent families. He told Reeves, "You left Mr. and Mrs. Chappell on the floor bleeding to death, and all of the time their 2 children were asleep upstairs. Your murderous behavior left them orphans. They were put to bed that night by their parents and they would never see them again." The judge continued, "The harm you did those 2 innocent children is incalculable." At 35 years old at the time of sentencing, Reeves would be 73 before he could even be considered for release. In practical terms, it was a life sentence in every sense. The families of Stephen and Jennifer read victim impact statements in court, trying to put into words the magnitude of their loss. Jennifer's mother, Ann Clayton, said, "For a mother to lose a child is something that causes never-ending pain. Knowing there will forever be a darkness inside you, a light switched off in your soul that can never be replaced." She added, "The thoughts that enter your head every day, dark, horrid thoughts, you don't want to imagine the fear that they felt, the suffering that they endured, what their final thoughts were." The family spoke about what Jennifer and Stephen would miss. Birthdays, Christmases, graduations, weddings. All the moments parents dream of sharing with their children, stolen in 1 minute of violence. But their statements also focused on the 2 boys left behind. Stephen's sister, Marie Chappell, who took in her nephews, said she was devoted to keeping the victims' memories alive so their sons would never forget how loved they were. She added, "I know from experience working with troubled teenagers that it will be their adolescent years that will be difficult, when they truly understand everything that has happened and begin to process it in the same way as I am now." The family made a difficult decision early on. Jennifer's sister explained that they decided to tell the boys what had happened, so they didn't have to keep wondering where Mommy and Daddy were. How do you explain to a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old that their parents aren't coming back, that they were murdered by the man who lived next door? It's an impossible conversation, but they knew the boys needed truth. not comforting lies that would unravel later. The story didn't end with the sentencing. In March 2023, 3 appeal judges reduced Reeves's minimum sentence from 38 years to 35 years, saying the original sentence was excessive. The Lord Justice Holroyd said the issue was whether the trial judge correctly balanced mitigating and aggravating factors, including Reeves's remorse, depression, military service, and confession. Reeves's defense lawyer, Joe Martin KC, told the appeal judges that Reeves had serious mental health issues and that the attack was a result of mania, describing it as 10 minutes of extraordinary behavior. For the families, this reduction was devastating. Jennifer's friend, Danny Lucas, started a petition to try to get the decision reversed. There are residents in Norton Fitzwarren currently diagnosed with PTSD from what they saw that night. She said, so for the appeal judge to say, well, I didn't quite consider Colin's mental state. Perhaps he needs to take a step back and consider everybody else's mental state in. Another friend, Melody Champion Smith, said, he is going to get to see his children. Jen and Stephen are never going to get to see theirs. There are going to be no birthday cards, Christmas cards, presents, because they've got none of that anymore. Because he took that. The petition gathered significant support, though ultimately it couldn't reverse the appeal court's decision. The legal system had spoken, even if it felt like another injustice to those who loved Stephen and Jennifer. Looking back at this case, it's hard not to ask, how did this happen? How does a parking dispute lead to murder? The answer is never simple. It's never really about the parking spaces, is it? It's about what those parking spaces represented in the minds of those involved. For Reeves, the parking dispute seems to have become tangled up with everything else that was going wrong in his life. His military career was behind him. His marriage was failing. He may have felt that he was losing control, that his life was slipping away from him. And there, every single day, was this reminder of his powerlessness. His neighbors' cars, parked where he didn't think they should be. In that context, when his wife asked for a separation, it may have been the final straw. And in his mind, somehow, the Chapels became responsible for his pain. In the 1999 call, he said, I couldn't let her or them torment Kaylee anymore, as if he had been protecting his wife rather than destroying another family. But we should be clear, none of this excuses what he did. Many people face similar challenges: marital problems, job stress, the difficulty of transitioning from military to civilian life, without murdering their neighbors. Depression, even significant depression, doesn't typically lead to premeditated violence. Reeves took his ceremonial dagger out of its frame. He climbed a fence. He entered someone else's home uninvited. He stabbed 2 unarmed people to death while their children slept upstairs. Those were choices, made in sequence, each one an opportunity to stop, to turn back, to choose differently. Following details of the murder coming to light, senior Somerset coroner Samantha Marsh wrote a letter to Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, urging the Army to stop giving out weapons as retirement gifts. It's a small measure, but perhaps one that could prevent a similar tragedy in the future. The ceremonial dagger that killed the Chapels was meant to be a symbol of honor and service, but in the wrong hands, at the wrong moment, it became an instrument of destruction. The 2 boys, now being raised by their Aunt Marie, are growing up without their parents. Family members spoke about their fear that the boys were so young they might not remember their parents, and described helping them through the funeral and their first Christmas without them. But Marie and the rest of the family are determined that Stephen and Jennifer won't be forgotten. They're keeping photo albums, telling stories, making sure the boys know they were loved fiercely by the parents they lost too soon. In Norton Fitzwarren, the case left deep scars. As one friend noted, residents were diagnosed with PTSD from what they witnessed that night. The quiet village had experienced something that shattered its sense of safety. People who had been having their own mundane disputes with neighbors suddenly saw those conflicts in a darker light. The Dragon Rise development, built as a place for families to thrive, would forever be marked by what happened on November 21. The house where the Chapels died stands as a reminder that tragedy can strike anywhere, that violence can emerge from the most unexpected places. There's something particularly haunting about this case, because it involves such ordinary circumstances spiraling into something catastrophic. We can all imagine having problems with neighbors. We can all understand the frustration of parking disputes, the stress of marital problems, the challenge of adjusting to major life changes. What we struggle to understand is how anyone could let those frustrations transform into violence. How the gap between irritation and murder could be crossed. Jennifer Chappell told people she was afraid. She sensed something dangerous in her neighbor. But what could she do with that fear? Move? That's not easy or affordable for most families. Call the police? For what? Angry words caught on a doorbell camera. There was no crime until the night there was the worst crime imaginable. And this is part of what makes the case so troubling. The warning signs were there, but they weren't enough to prevent what happened. Jennifer's fear was valid, prescient even, but it couldn't save her. The justice system did what it could. Reeves was caught, tried, and convicted. He received a significant sentence. But justice, in cases like this, is always imperfect. No prison term can bring back Stephen and Jennifer. No verdict can give those two boys back their childhood, their parents, their innocence. We're left with questions about prevention. How do we identify when conflicts are escalating dangerously? How do we intervene before it's too late? How do we support people who are struggling without excusing those who choose violence? There are no easy answers. We can only learn what we can from each tragedy and try to do better. If there's anything to hold on to in this story, it's the resilience and love of the family members who stepped up for those two boys. Marie Chappell, taking on the role of parent to her nephews, determined to give them everything their parents would have wanted for them. The boys will grow up knowing their story. They'll know their parents loved them. They'll know what was taken from them. But they'll also know they were surrounded by people who loved them enough to carry on, to rebuild, to ensure that one night of violence didn't define their entire lives. Somewhere in Somerset tonight, those boys are sleeping safely, cared for by family who will never let them forget Stephen and Jennifer Chappell, not as victims of a tragedy, but as the loving, devoted parents they were. And perhaps that's the real legacy. Not the horror of how they died, but the love they lived with, and the love that continues to surround their children. The murders of Stephen and Jennifer Chappell serve as a stark reminder that we never fully know what's happening in the minds of those around us, that seemingly minor conflicts can mask deeper problems, that violence can erupt with shocking suddenness from places we never expected. But they also remind us of the preciousness of ordinary life. Parents putting their children to bed, couples relaxing on a Sunday evening, the simple routines that make up our days. Stephen and Jennifer were living unremarkable lives in the best possible way, raising their children, doing their jobs, being present for each other and their family. They deserve to grow old together. They deserve to see their boys graduate, fall in love, have families of their own. They deserved decades more of those ordinary, precious moments. Instead, in 1 minute of violence, all of that was stolen from them. Their story lives on, though, in the memories of those who loved them, in the children they left behind, and in the lessons we can learn about the value of every single peaceful, ordinary day. Rest well. Tomorrow we'll remember why we lock our doors, why we take conflict seriously, and why we should never take for granted the simple gift of waking up safe in our homes. But tonight, we honor the memory of Stephen and Jennifer Chappell, two people who deserved so much more than the ending they received. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.